a romance for the ages. She was a devoted single mother looking for a fresh start.
She was a nice young lady, you know, very warm, very caring.
He was a small-town cop who'd sworn to serve her and protect her.
Police work was his passion. He bled blue.
But just when it seems their relationship is destined for new heights, tragedy strikes like a lightning bolt.
Yes, man, something ain't right.
A terrifying disappearance sparks a massive search.
Deep down, I think everybody knew something was very wrong.
And a mysterious string of notes left behind points police in the direction of an unlikely suspect.
That note was a note of somebody very troubled.
When the cloud of mystery is lifted, one person is dead, and a key witness has no memory of what's transpired.
He was found laying face down.
There's blood on the bed, there's blood on the floor. She's laying kind of crumpled.
I didn't believe it, didn't want to believe it, you know. This is not happening.
It was like an episode of The Twilight Zone. She has the knowledge of Wayne's murder, but not the memory of it.
December 11th, 2004. It's a tranquil evening in the city of Gainesville, Texas. But just past 4 a.m., a night manager at a local hotel receives an alarming call from one of their guests. Heading down the hall to investigate, the manager attempts to enter the guest's room, but finds it locked.
Hello, ma'am? Ma'am, hello? Miss? Management?
The door had the deadbolt, so the front desk worker called the maintenance man and actually had him break down the door.
Stepping inside the darkened room, the two men make a startling discovery. Lying on the floor and alone in the room is the female caller.
The room was kind of in a disarray, and they found her laying bloody on the floor, crumpled up, almost fetal-like position.
The woman seems to be in a daze and is slurring her words.
I just need to get up. She's on the floor, and she has what they can see as a gunshot wound.
The bullet went in her head just above her eye.
No, just stay down, okay? Just stay down.
Lying beside the woman is a .25 caliber handgun.
Just keep talking to us.
The hotel manager dials 911.
Yes, I need emergency. I've got a woman shot.
Within minutes, police officers are on the scene.
When they get there, the scene is fairly chaotic. Their first response is number one, to take care of her, to try to assess her injuries and save her life.
Ma'am, where are you hurt? Ooh, hey, let's make sure we get an ambulance for her real quick.
Storm at 1047. I got one black female, gunshot wound to the head. Step it up, please.
EMTs arrive moments later, and the woman is immediately rushed to a nearby trauma center. But given her life-threatening injuries, it's unclear whether she'll live or die. Meanwhile, at the hotel, authorities try and make sense of what happened.
There was alcohol there. I think there were some over-the-counter sleeping pills and things she had bought.
Finding no one else in the room, officers are left with one of two scenarios. Either the woman's injuries were self-inflicted, or her assailant had fled the scene.
It's like, what is going on here? Why is the room torn up? Like, why? What is going on?
The whole thing just seemed more bizarre than anything.
The situation grows more disturbing when police identify the woman as Denise Miller and discover that Denise and her boyfriend, police officer Wayne Irby, were reported missing just 24 hours earlier.
Officer Irby did not show up for work. He's missing and she's missing. That raised everybody's red flags.
But what exactly had happened, and where was Denise's boyfriend now? Unraveling that mystery would require investigators to reconstruct the terrible events of the last 24 hours, and along the way, expose a tale of love, jealousy, and some say, cold-blooded murder. Growing up in Kansas City, Missouri, Denise Swall was one of the most popular girls in school.
Everybody liked Denise. She seemed like such a sweet person, bubbly and personable.
Even as a teenager, Denise dreamed of the day she could start her own family. A dream that seemed to come true when at 22, she married her college sweetheart. In 1986, Denise gave birth to a beautiful baby girl named Whitney, and 2 years later, to son Walter.
They were wonderful children. Both of her kids were wonderful kids.
But after the birth of her children, Denise's marriage began to falter. In 1995, she and her husband filed for divorce. Looking to start her life over, at 36, Denise packed up the kids and moved to the close-knit Dallas suburb of Little Elm, Texas.
She was just looking for a clean slate, you know, a fresh start, just getting away from old places that probably brought up bad memories.
Denise landed a great job with a local liquor distributor. She managed her money well and was able to build a stunning new home for her and her children.
She seemed to be very successful, beautiful home, beautiful family, pictures on the wall. Everything was perfect.
Well, almost perfect. Denise still wanted a good man to share her success with. Then one day in 2003, Denise answered a knock on her front door and was caught off guard to see a police officer standing outside.
Hi, how you doing?
Hello.
My name is Wayne Irby of the Little Elm Police Department. I noticed you had your garage door open. We got a lot of thefts in the neighborhood. You might want to close it.
Okay.
Well, I'm giving you my card, okay? You give me a call if you need anything, all right?
I will do that.
All right, now appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, now.
Denise appreciated the gesture, especially since it was coming from a big, strong officer like 37-year-old Wayne Irby. A 6-year veteran of the Little Elm Police Department, Wayne wore his passion for his job on his sleeve.
And he bled blue, as we say in the law enforcement industry.
He was somebody that liked to get out and meet people on his beat. He was just one of those people that made you feel good.
It wasn't long before Officer Irby came knocking on Denise's door again. But this time, it had nothing to do with police work.
Since we last met, I definitely couldn't stop thinking about you. And I was hoping I could take you out to dinner, you know, maybe a movie.
Sure.
He told me, man, I met this young lady. He said, I think I'm gonna settle down with this one.
Denise felt the same way. And after their very first date, the couple became exclusive.
He took to her just as much as she was taken by him. And I think it clicked in that sense. I mean, how could it not?
Wayne Irby started talking about how serious they were getting. He said he really liked Denise a lot.
Receive $100?
A divorced dad himself, Wayne was an immediate hit with Denise's 2 kids.
The kids and him got along great. They treated Wayne like a father figure. They seemed to be all one big happy family.
Even so, as the relationship progressed, Denise began to suspect Wayne was just a little too friendly with some other women he ran into on his beat.
He was a ladies' man. There were a lot of women in the community and outside of the community that would talk about him often.
Eventually, Denise confronted Wayne about the situation, but Wayne vehemently denied the accusations.
He would get upset with her and tell her, you know, there's nothing going on with anybody. He'd tell me, Walker, man, I'm not doing anything.
Was Wayne being honest? On the surface, it was hard to tell. Either way, the allegations took a toll on the relationship.
When there is a trust break, not only do you mistrust that person, then you mistrust the things within yourself.
But by the spring of 2004, Wayne and Denise seemed to have put their trust issues behind them. And later that year, the couple bought a house together.
At that point in his life, he was ready to settle down, and that's the reason he bought that home with her.
But life under the same roof wasn't everything Wayne and Denise expected. And soon, the couple's old trust issues began to rear their head again. A few months later, Wayne decided they should go their separate ways.
There's a lot of crying, a lot of tears.
They were fighting, and he was threatening on leaving.
Wayne moved into a rental home across town. But when Denise unexpectedly lost her job in November of that year, he began having second thoughts about the separation.
They reconciled when Denise lost her job because he didn't want her and her children to not have a home, and tried to work it out.
But just as it seemed Denise and Wayne were back on track, their world turned upside down. It begins at 6 a.m. on December 10th, 2004. Members of the Little Elm Police Department file into their squad room for their morning briefing. Everyone, that is, except for Wayne Irby.
And he hadn't come in. And so, you know, he called, he didn't answer. And that was, well, first of all, it wasn't normal behavior.
Irby? Have I seen Irby? When he comes in, let me know.
An hour passes, then 2. Wayne is still a no-show for work.
He was always at work, there early, ready to go.
It's uncommon, almost unheard of, for an officer to not show up on duty when it's his turn. And so everyone knew early on that something was just not right.
What no one on the police force realizes is that Officer Wayne Irby isn't the only missing person in the town of Little Elm. So is the love of his life. A chance encounter sparked a fiery romance between Denise Miller and police officer Wayne Irby. But despite their undeniable chemistry, the relationship had its fair share of ups and downs.
It was somewhat stormy. They had their problems.
Things had gotten serious, but there was a concern about her jealous tendencies, and there were some underlying issues in their relationship that had to be resolved.
Just when it seems Denise and Wayne patch things up, police in their hometown of Little Elm, Texas, find themselves embroiled in a mystery. It starts on December 10th, 2004, when Wayne failed to report to duty for his 6 a.m. shift.
Wayne was not somebody that was late. And so when he did not show up as he was scheduled, didn't come to briefing, didn't call anybody, people began to worry.
That just didn't make any sense. Wayne always checked his phone. He always played his messages.
But as the hours roll by, Wayne's friends on the force grow increasingly concerned, particularly Cynthia Medrano.
I went into the chief's office and I said, something's wrong. He's not calling me back. Something's wrong.
Hey, Cynthia, what can I do for you?
I haven't heard from Wayne at all, and I'm really worried.
Tell you what, I'll have a couple officers swing by and do a welfare check, okay?
Thank you.
Just before noon, Police Chief Waylon Rhodes dispatches officers to conduct a welfare check at the house Wayne shares with Denise and her children.
We had officers go by Denise's home. We knocked and nobody answered.
There were no vehicles in the driveway. The doors were locked, front and back door.
Now unable to locate either Wayne or Denise, police shoot for the next best thing.
We went to the high school and talked to the kids, Denise's kids.
I'd like to ask you a few questions, if that's okay.
That's fine. According to Denise's children, they hadn't seen their mom or Wayne in nearly 24 hours.
They had said she had not come home that night and didn't know where she was.
Denise's daughter, Whitney, also recounts a disturbing phone call she'd received around midnight.
She was like, I'm running errands, and then she said, I love you.
Is that unusual?
She doesn't usually talk like that.
She doesn't.
She said that they could get themselves ready for school in the morning. Her kids were old enough and certainly mature enough to take care of themselves, and it's exactly what they did.
Whitney states that before heading off to school that morning, she tried to call her mother one more time.
She wasn't answering her cell phone. They couldn't find their mom. She was missing.
Whitney says this seemed completely out of character for their mother. For police, it's a startling turn of events. They've got not one, but two missing persons.
Deep down, I think everybody knew something was very wrong.
Nobody is more concerned for Wayne Irby's safety than his partner on the force, Jerry Walker. After searching the streets of Little Elm for hours, Walker and another officer, James Wynn, decide to check out the rental home Wayne vacated when he moved back in with Denise. They obtain a key from the landlord and prepare to enter the home.
Wayne? Wayne! Dining room clear.
In the kitchen, officers make an ominous discovery.
He and I both observed Wayne's fanny pack that he carried with him often and his cell phone. And that was a sign immediately that this was not good.
Moments later, Officer James Wynn turns the corner down a hallway and sees something that stops him dead in his tracks.
James Wynn sliced around the corner and took a gasp of breath. And he stopped and backed up, and he looked at me and said,
Don't come any closer.
Just stop right where you're at.
But at this point, Detective Walker has come too far not to press forward.
Wayne Irby was lying on the ground, and there was what looked like an injury to the back of his head.
There was no sign of any fight or any violence at all.
It seems the search for Wayne Irby has just taken a turn from the mysterious to the macabre. But where is Denise? It's a question that will soon be magnified by another troubling discovery. Hunt for missing police officer Wayne Irby and his longtime girlfriend Denise Miller has just taken a dark and bloody turn. Police have found Wayne inside a rental home in Little Elm, Texas, the victim of an apparent gunshot wound.
It was very sullen moment. This was the first murder of my career, and it happened to be my partner.
I was at work when I got the call. It was devastating.
Given that Denise had failed to return home the previous evening, officers fear for her safety as well. But they find no sign of Denise anywhere inside Wayne's home.
It didn't take more than 40 seconds to finish up checking the rest of the rooms, and she wasn't there.
Officers radio for backup. Within minutes, investigators from both the Denton County Sheriff's Office and the Texas Rangers begin the grim task of processing the scene.
He was shot one single time, right almost dead center in the back of the head.
The location of the wounds suggests Officer Irby never saw the kill shot coming.
Yeah, so that would place the shooter about here.
Was it possible Wayne had been ambushed? If so, by whom? Given Wayne's passion for police work, one possible theory is that the shooting could be work-related.
In police work, you're not gonna always make everybody happy. Sometimes, no matter what you do, you're gonna piss somebody off.
However, Wayne's partner, Jerry Walker, finds it difficult to believe Wayne's murder is related to the job.
He's just a very personable guy. Easy to talk to, always smiling, you know? There's no way he could have had any enemies out there.
But if the crime isn't work-related, then what sparked this fatal encounter? Given the timing of Denise's disappearance, detectives can't help but wonder if she could be involved.
She was not there, and Wayne's handguns were not there either. We didn't know where she had gone.
But to those who know Denise and Wayne best, this theory seems equally implausible.
I don't think anybody thought that she was capable of doing something like this.
I didn't see that side of Denise. I thought she was a very caring young lady.
Still, Denise's sudden disappearance does raise a number of troubling questions, not the least of which is the fear that she may be a victim as well.
We put out an all-points bulletin for Denise Miller with her description and vehicle description that we knew of, and then just hope to hear something soon.
While patrol officers search for Denise, detectives begin the process of interviewing friends and colleagues, and quickly realize Wayne and Denise have had their ups and downs. The roots of the couple's problems always centered on one thing: Denise's suspicions that Wayne was cheating on her.
He was really friendly, though, so that might have been just a natural response. He was really friendly, really charming.
There was a constant thought that he was doing something outside of their relationship that he shouldn't be.
She was always accusing him of messing with other women. She never trusted him.
In speaking to the couple's friends, investigators can't help but wonder if there's some truth to the rumors of Wayne's infidelity. But if the allegations are true, it opens up a whole Pandora's box of possible suspects.
It could be one of them other female friends that he was talking to that he cut ties with. You know, if I can't have him, you can't, and then I'm gonna end your life too.
With the case getting more twisted and more scandalous by the minute, police decide to search Denise's home in Little Elm.
We go through and we start looking and we don't see any signs of anything.
But in the master bedroom, investigators find a startling piece of evidence.
They found a note. It was a handwritten note, seemed to be coming from Denise.
The letter, I think, was indicative of someone who was contemplating suicide, if you read between the lines.
But the note isn't the only discovery that gives investigators cause for alarm.
Here's his duty belt.
When they were searching the house, his uniforms are hung in the closet. His duty belt is hanging on the wall, and the holster was empty.
Did you find his gun?
No, sir, I haven't.
We need to find that thing.
Between the missing weapon and the possible suicide note, it seems a new theory about Wayne's death is beginning to emerge.
You know, the police are never, ever going to rule out any other possibilities, but everything in this case pointed towards Denise.
But is Denise truly responsible for Wayne's death? Or are other more sinister factors at play? While police are still uncertain, one thing is clear. They need to find Denise Miller, and they need to find her fast. December 10th, 2004, investigators in Little Elm, Texas have discovered missing police officer Wayne Irby gunned down inside his former rental home. At first, detectives feared Wayne's girlfriend Denise might also be a victim. However, a bizarre note found inside the home they shared, coupled with a missing handgun, have detectives wondering if Denise might have killed Wayne, then turned the gun on herself.
They found a note inside Denise Miller's house. It was a disturbing note saying, "I'm tired of hurting. I don't want to hurt anymore." It was kind of a desperate plea.
If Denise has taken her own life, it's imperative detectives find her body. But there's a chance the suicide note is just a ruse. And if so, they must consider Denise armed and dangerous.
I was worried about another police officer having an encounter with her, and either A, her harming him, or B, him having to use deadly force against her. So everyone was very aware of the situation.
As their search for Denise intensifies, investigators must decipher what Denise meant by her troubling letter. Curious if the couple had any prior domestic altercations, detectives decide to dig deeper into Denise and Wayne's relationship and make a shocking discovery in the process.
She had come to the police department to file a complaint against Officer Irby for domestic violence. She had said that he had assaulted her.
According to the affidavit from December 2003, it started when Denise showed up unannounced at Wayne's rental home and discovered Wayne with another woman.
Denise showed up at his house, and the house that he lived in had a window right by the door, and you could see the female's purse on the table. And Denise kept knocking on the door. He was not going to open the door because he knew there would be trouble.
But Denise wouldn't stop knocking. Eventually, Wayne opened the door.
That's when all hell broke loose.
Who is that woman?
Look, Denise, she's just a friend of mine.
Wayne, what is she doing here?
We're just having a cup of coffee, that's it.
The report asserts that the couple started arguing, and the encounter quickly turned physical.
Every time I turn around, you're doing the same thing!
According to the incident report, both Denise and Wayne suffered physical injuries, but it seems Wayne got the worst of it.
He had scratches all over his face. He had a big black eye.
Pursuant to the report, Wayne claimed Denise had been the aggressor and that he'd simply tried to defuse the situation.
She went nuts. She started smacking him and hitting him and punching him.
When Wayne's female friend corroborated his version of the incident, Denise withdrew her complaint.
She came in, I think, the next day and said she had made it up. It didn't really happen. They talked to Wayne, and he said that she had come at him, and he was really trying to defend himself, and he had injuries too.
I think it was a heat of the moment situation, and they were arguing or fighting or something. She got mad, and she was going to take her pound of flesh, and it didn't matter to her what happened.
And according to several of Wayne's friends, after the incident, Denise's behavior grew increasingly erratic.
He and I were working a traffic crash, and we were out on the road for a long time. And when he got back in the car, he just shook his head and showed me a cell phone with many, many missed calls, and they were all from Denise Miller.
It got to the point where he just, he felt smothered and smelled like, she was just too jealous. He said, "I can't take this anymore."
One of Wayne's friends told investigators that the day before his death, Wayne decided to end things with Denise once and for all.
They wasn't getting along as well, and he mentioned to me that he was going to move out, and he just wanted out altogether. His mind was made up.
Along with her suicide note, Wayne's decision to leave Denise for good seems to cement her involvement in his murder. As does another chilling bit of evidence CSIs later find at the scene of the crime.
At Wayne Irby's residence, they found on the kitchen island a handwritten note from Denise that said, "I'm sorry, I took both of our lives. Please contact our moms."
Basically, it was a confession note that she apologized for what she had done.
So I was just shocked. I didn't believe it. Didn't want to believe it, This is not happening.
The notes suggest Denise has also taken her own life, but investigators know that finding her is now more important than ever.
I really thought in the back of my head that she had gone somewhere else to commit suicide. But she's capable of shooting someone she loved. She's more than capable of shooting anyone else.
Thankfully, it doesn't take long for the all-points bulletin on Denise to pay dividends. And at 4 a.m. on December 11th, police in Little Elm receive a call of a possible suicide attempt at a hotel in nearby Gainesville.
We got a call from Gainesville police. They linked the bulletin that we put out to Denise Miller. She had a gunshot wound to the head.
They found Denise on the floor with the covers off of the bed, obviously in distress. She was seriously injured. The .25 caliber handgun was found on the floor next to her.
Paramedics rushed Denise to an area hospital. In the meantime, investigators combed the room for evidence.
There was alcohol there. There was some over-the-counter sleeping pills.
Investigators also find Wayne's missing .40 caliber service pistol inside the room, along with evidence that explains how Denise's suicide attempt went awry.
They found one of Wayne's handguns. It looked like she'd attempted to load it and tried to load it with the bullet backwards so it wouldn't chamber.
When Wayne's service weapon jammed, it appeared Denise had tried to end her life using the next best thing, a .25 caliber pistol.
She's probably crying the whole way, like, oh my God, what have I done? You know, probably remorse has set in.
I think she wanted to forget about what she just did. If she bought the bottle of alcohol and sleeping pills, she just wanted to forget about everything. But then, you know, it was her time to try to end her life too.
But just when it seems like police are starting to put the pieces of this puzzle together, investigators discover a third suicide note, one that suggests that even though she planned to kill herself, Denise hadn't intended to kill the love of her life.
She writes a very lengthy, at least in comparison to the two previous notes, a very lengthy suicide note.
There was a line in the note that alluded to her accidentally shooting Wayne and that she freaked out and just ran.
But was Wayne's death truly an accident? Only one person knew for certain, and she was lying in a hospital bed with a bullet lodged in her brain. And the story she'd tell police would throw the entire case into an upheaval.
Denise, can you tell me what happened in Little Elm last night?
Nothing.
You know Wayne's hurt, right?
I don't think so.
Depending on where she was shot in her head, it could just cause a lot of things. It can cause amnesia, you know, temporary memory loss. She's not clearly in her right mind.
On December 11th, 2004, just 12 hours after her longtime lover Wayne Irby was found shot to death, Denise Miller put a .25 caliber handgun to her head and pulled the trigger. Detectives have also found a series of suicide notes that seem to link Denise to Wayne's murder and suggest that if Denise couldn't have Wayne, no one could.
Wayne had made his mind up to end that relationship.
She's not clearly in her right mind because everything is going on in her head. It could have been a psychotic break.
But just when police seem to have solved the crime, a third and final suicide note found inside Denise's hotel room suggests Wayne's death might not have been intentional.
There was a single line about it was an accident.
Hoping to unravel this mystery before it's too late, investigators race to the hospital where Denise is being treated for the self-inflicted gunshot wound.
Denise Miller shot herself in the head. That trauma affected her brain, her cognitive abilities. It also affected her motor skills.
Despite her injuries, investigators believe Denise is coherent enough to provide a statement.
They're not sure at that point what her prognosis is going to be, so I wanted to get as much as a statement as I could from her.
That afternoon, doctors allowed Texas Ranger Tracy Murphy to proceed with the interview.
I'd like to ask you a few questions.
Placing a recorder by her bedside, Murphy questions Denise about the events leading up to the shooting.
Denise, can you tell me what happened in Little Elm last night?
Nothing.
You know Wayne's hurt, right?
I don't think so.
You don't think so? How come you left a note there telling me what happened to Wayne?
I don't know.
She could talk, but she had very limited recollection at that time of what had gone on. According to her, she was not aware that she had shot herself.
Although clearly reeling from injuries, when pressed for more details, Denise does admit to being in Wayne's house the day of the shooting.
Did you see him at his new house?
Yeah.
What happened there, Denise?
We argued.
About him moving out?
Yeah.
Then what happened?
I left.
When I told her that she had hurt Wayne, she said she hadn't. And then when I told her, I said, look, Wayne's dead, her basic response was, no, he's not.
It seemed suspicious to us that she could remember things from before, she could remember things from after, but somehow the part about killing Wayne Irby was gone.
Is Denise in denial? Or is there another possible explanation for her sudden memory loss?
She's got a combination of drugs and alcohol in her system, and she shot herself. So all that combined, you can kind of understand why she's completely disoriented.
The brain is a powerful thing. It's a powerful mechanism. It will shut down to protect you. Me personally, I've had a head injury, and I can't tell you certain things that happened. I can tell you what other people have told me, and I can remember certain incidents, but the actual time that it happened, I couldn't tell you.
After being questioned, Denise is sedated and flown to a nearby trauma center for additional treatment. When she wakes the following morning, her memory loss seems to have gotten worse. She's also now paralyzed on one side of her body and blind in one eye.
The nurse stated that when she told Denise that Wayne had been killed and that she had shot herself, that she seemed genuinely shocked.
It was very convenient for her not to have to remember what she did. But the fact of the matter was she killed a human being.
It was frustrating to a lot of officers, yeah, because everyone really wonders, is she just faking it?
On December 13th, police received the results of Wayne's autopsy report. The official cause of death is trauma caused by a single .25 caliber bullet to the back of the head. Ballistics revealed the bullet was fired from the exact same weapon Denise used in her botched suicide attempt. Running the weapon's serial number, police learned the gun is registered to Denise's stepfather. So how did it end up in Wayne's rental home? To investigators, the answer seems obvious.
I think she took that gun with her there to give him an ultimatum that she wanted him back, and if the answer was no, I think she intended to use it.
If she's going over to a situation that she knows is volatile, or at least not good, and takes a gun with her, this was not an accident.
On January 18th, 2005, police charged Denise Miller with first-degree murder. News of her arrest leaves friends and a community stunned.
People were numb, couldn't believe what happened.
I think everyone, or at least the people that were close to Wayne and knew Denise, didn't see it coming.
After 18 months of rehab and physical therapy, Denise is declared competent to stand trial. On July 10, 2006, at the Denton County Courthouse, the state of Texas versus Denise Miller gets underway. While the victim's friends and family are desperate to see justice served, Denise's supporters believe she's already paid a steep price for her own actions.
She was in a wheelchair. She was a very frail and weakened condition.
In their opening arguments, prosecutors urged jurors not to be swayed by Denise's frail appearance.
The prosecution said she looks like this, she acts like this, she's in this wheelchair because of something she did to herself.
Describing Denise as a jealous lover hell-bent on controlling her man, prosecutors assert that on December 9, 2004, Denise drove to Wayne's rental home armed with her stepfather's .25 caliber handgun. An argument allegedly ensued, and Wayne told Denise that the relationship was over once and for all.
I just can't do this anymore. You know, I was never cheating on you. You know, I've been there for you guys. You know, I love the kids. I can't do it anymore. I'm tired.
That's when, according to prosecutors, Denise took aim and fired.
Denise came to the house. She brought her .25 caliber handgun with her. There appears to have been an argument. Either Wayne was done arguing or he saw the gun. One reason or another, he turned his back on her and he was shot.
They called it the classic case of, if I can't have you, nobody else can.
To bolster their case, prosecutors introduced Denise's 3 suicide notes as evidence.
It's a confession. I mean, those notes were confessions.
Although defense attorneys don't dispute Denise had shot Wayne, they argue the officer's death had been a tragic accident.
She did go into a volatile situation. She did have a gun with her, but she didn't mean to do it. It was an accident.
And the proof, they claim, were Denise's own words in the moments before she shot herself.
They pointed to the note that said, I didn't mean to do it. I freaked out and I ran.
When people are writing their last note, their last words, their dying declaration, it's usually pretty credible. You can usually take it at face value.
But in Cross, prosecutors urged jurors to judge the body of that work and not one line possibly taken out of context.
There was a single line about it was an accident, but it was surrounded by a lot of things that indicate it wasn't an accident. Things like, thou shalt not kill, I've done a horrible thing. So it's like she mixes in her guilt with that one line.
Still, defense attorneys argue that if Denise had truly intended to kill Wayne that day, her gun would have been fully loaded and she would have pulled the trigger more than once.
Typically, if you're going in with the intent, the purposeful intent of killing someone, your weapon's fully loaded. It's not kind of a Russian roulette situation. It wasn't fully loaded when he was shot.
It appears Denise's defense team has at least raised the possibility that Wayne's death was an accident. But prosecutors still have one piece of evidence at their disposal, evidence that has the potential to make or break the entire case. Charged with the murder of her boyfriend, Wayne Irby, Denise Miller now found herself on trial for a crime she claims to have no memory of committing.
She shot herself in the head. She was in a wheelchair. She had very limited mobility, and she had no recollection of the events whatsoever.
Her defense attorney said it was like an episode of The Twilight Zone. She has the knowledge of Wayne's murder, but not the memory of it.
Defense attorneys have asserted Wayne's death had been a tragic accident. Prosecutors have argued otherwise.
If this was truly an accident, wouldn't you call for help? Wouldn't you call for an ambulance? Miss Miller chose not to do any of these things.
And to bolster their claim that the crime was premeditated, that Denise couldn't have accidentally shot Wayne, they submit findings from the state crime lab into evidence.
We had the trigger of this gun tested, and it takes 4.5 to 5 pounds of pressure just to pull the trigger on this gun. That negates that, she just accidentally touched it and it went off.
Even more telling is the location of Wayne's injuries and Denise's own actions in the aftermath of the shooting.
Shot in the back of the head, what are the chances of accidentally being shot in the back of the head?
If it was truly an accident, the first thing you're going to do is call for an ambulance, call for help. She didn't do that. Instead, she took his gun, wrote a note confessing, and fled.
But could a jury really convict Denise of a crime she had no recollection of committing?
It's a roll of the dice. Whether or not the jury's going to have any empathy or sympathy for her, or if they're going to say, you got what you deserved.
It wouldn't take them long to find out. After less than an hour of deliberation, on July 12, 2006, the jury returns with their verdict. Guilty.
Denise was in a wheelchair and she was very quiet, and when the verdict came back, she cried.
While the verdict surprises few in the courtroom, a bigger question still looms. Would jurors take sympathy on the already crippled woman and forego the death penalty?
They can look at her and think, she suffered enough. She felt so bad about what she did. She tried to kill herself, and now look at her. She's, disabled for the rest of her life. She's been punished enough.
The following morning at Denise's sentencing hearing, it appears jurors are in a forgiving mood. Denise is spared the death penalty. Instead, she's sentenced to 62 years in prison.
She wasn't a hardened criminal. She certainly wasn't any kind of threat. A 62-year sentence, it's equivalent to a life sentence, but it's not that word.
I think she should have gotten the death penalty myself.
Her two kids lost a mother. Their every family lost a son, so everybody lost in this situation. There wasn't a win in this situation at all.
The candles on the cake were flickering, 80 tiny flames casting long, dancing shadows against the walls of the modest Boston suburban home, illuminating the faces of 3 generations gathered in a moment of pure, domestic bliss. It was a Saturday evening, the air thick with the scent of buttercream frosting and expensive cologne, a celebration of a life well lived, a testament to the quiet, dignified path of Elias Thorne. To those in the room, the doting grandchildren, the proud children, the neighbors who had known him for decades, Elias was the embodiment of the American dream, a retired school administrator, a man of soft smiles, a regular at the local park, a grandfather who could fix any broken toy and soothe any childhood fear. But as the clock struck 8, the front door didn't herald the arrival of a late guest or a neighbor with a gift. It signaled the end of a 40-year deception that had hidden a predator in plain sight. Tactical lights, bright and blinding, flooded the living room, the quiet hum of laughter shattered by the bark of orders and the metallic click of handcuffs that turned a birthday celebration into the stage for a reckoning that the city of Boston had long ago deemed a ghost of the past. The story of the Thorne case is not one of sudden discovery, but of a long, agonizing wait in the dark, a cold case that haunted the corridors of the Boston Police Department since the biting winter of 1994. It began with the disappearance of Sarah Jenkins, a 22-year-old nursing student who vanished into the thin, frozen air of a November night, leaving behind nothing but a stalled car on a lonely stretch of road and a community paralyzed by a fear that refused to dissipate. For years, the Jenkins file was a jagged stone in the shoe of every investigator who walked the halls of the homicide unit, a case that refused to be forgotten even as the evidence grew stale and the trails turned to dust. The disappearance was a puzzle with missing pieces that defied logic, a void that swallowed a young woman's potential and left her family to navigate a life defined by the absence of an answer. In the early 90s, Boston was a city undergoing a painful metamorphosis, its streets caught in the crosshairs of social change and the persistent, creeping threat of random violence. When Sarah Jenkins vanished, the initial search was nothing short of monumental, an entire city galvanized by the sight of her smiling face on every telephone pole, every bus stop, every nightly news broadcast. Volunteers waded through the icy marshes of the outlying districts, their breath blooming in the frigid air like white ghosts, while detectives interrogated every acquaintance, every passerby, every potential shadow that crossed her path. Yet, the investigation was a race against the biting cold, a futile struggle against a perpetrator who seemed to have anticipated every move, a phantom who left behind no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no trail to follow into the abyss. As the weeks bled into months, the frantic energy of the initial search withered into a grim, stoic acceptance of the unknown, the kind of silence that settles over a home after a tragedy has been processed but not resolved. The Jenkins family, once at the center of a media storm, found themselves drifting in a sea of isolation, their hope flickering like a candle in a gale. They held vigils, they wrote letters to the press, they pleaded with anyone who might hold a shred of information to come forward, but the answers never came. The case was filed away, not as a closed book, but as an open wound, a cold case that would eventually be passed down from detective to detective, each one inheriting the burden of a mystery that seemed destined to haunt the history of Boston policing forever. It is in the nature of cold cases to become part of the background noise of a city, a static frequency that hums in the peripheral vision of the public, forgotten by all but those whose lives were permanently fractured by the event. For Elias Thorne, however, the passing of time was not a fading of memory, but a fortification of his anonymity. He had moved through the decades with a quiet, calculated grace, his life a masterpiece of conventionality that successfully shielded him from the prying eyes of the law. He had built a fortress out of respectability, his career, his family, and his social standing acting as the mortar that sealed the dark secret beneath. Every successful year he lived without being questioned was a victory in his private, terrifying game of survival, a testament to his ability to blend into the fabric of a world that never suspected the man behind the mask. Yet, justice is not a static concept. It is an evolving force, propelled by the relentless march of technology and the unyielding curiosity of those who refuse to let the past remain buried. In the quiet offices of the Cold Case Unit, a new generation of investigators, armed with tools that their predecessors could only dream of, began to re-examine the physical evidence from 1994. They focused on the overlooked, the discarded, and the microscopic, the infinitesimal traces of genetic material that had been preserved in the climate-controlled vaults, waiting for the moment when the science of the future could unlock the truth of the past. They didn't just want to solve a case. They wanted to provide the answers that had been stolen from the Jenkins family decades ago, a promise made in the name of a young woman whose voice had been silenced before it could ever truly ring out. The breakthrough, when it finally arrived, was a miracle of modern forensics, a convergence of genetic genealogy and investigative tenacity that bypassed the dead ends of traditional police work and pointed directly toward the truth. By reconstructing the suspect's genomic profile from a single, degraded sample found on the steering wheel of Sarah's abandoned car, the team was able to navigate the complex maze of family lineages, tracing the threads of ancestry until they converged on one name. The realization was both a shock and a confirmation, a moment where the weight of 40 years of secrets finally collapsed under the scrutiny of irrefutable science. The man who had been a beloved grandfather, a community staple, and a symbol of integrity was, in fact, the architect of a nightmare, a discovery that would not only rewrite the history of the case, but shatter the foundations of a family that had known him as a saint. The arrest warrant, signed with a steady hand by a judge who had grown up hearing the rumors of the Jenkins disappearance, was a document of profound finality. It was not just a piece of paper, it was the mechanism of a long-overdue justice, a signal that the time for silence had ended. When the tactical team surrounded the house, they were not just serving a warrant. They were dismantling a life built on a foundation of sand, exposing the core of a secret that had been guarded with such relentless, agonizing precision. The scene in the living room, the transition from the warmth of a birthday celebration to the cold, stark reality of a criminal arrest, was a cinematic clash of worlds, a moment where the past and the present collided with the force of an oncoming train, leaving the witnesses in a state of profound, disbelieving shock. As the officers led Elias Thorne out to the waiting cruiser, the night air seemed to hold its breath, the silence of the suburban street a stark contrast to the chaos of the arrest. Neighbors emerged from their homes, their faces illuminated by the red and blue flashing lights, witnessing the end of an era they hadn't realized was an illusion. The man who had been their friend, their mentor, and their reliable neighbor was now a vessel of suspicion, a personification of the very evil they thought they were safe from. The gravity of the situation began to set in, the realization spreading like wildfire that their perception of their own community had been fundamentally altered. The case was no longer just a cold case. It was a living, breathing reality that forced everyone to confront the fragility of their own trust, the depth of the darkness that can coexist with the light, and the terrifying possibility that the monsters we fear are sometimes the ones we know the best. The drive to the station was a surreal odyssey through the winding, familiar streets of a Boston that Elias Thorne had navigated for 40 years, yet every turn now felt like a descent into a new, terrifying reality. Inside the back of the cruiser, the air was stale, smelling of synthetic leather and the cold, metallic tang of the cage that separated him from the world he had cultivated so meticulously. The flashing lights painted the passing trees in rhythmic bursts of crimson and electric blue, turning the suburban night into a disorienting, strobing nightmare. Elias didn't speak. He didn't offer a defense, a plea, or a protest. He simply stared forward, his hands resting on his knees, his mind likely retreating into the same dark, fortified chambers where he had kept the secret of Sarah Jenkins since the twilight of 1994. The detectives in the front seat exchanged no words, their focus entirely on the navigation and the gravity of the man sitting behind them, a man who, in the eyes of his community, was the pinnacle of elderly grace, but who was now, by the cold logic of DNA, a monster in the making. When they arrived at the precinct, the atmosphere was one of controlled, intense electricity. Word had leaked through the department like a tremor, and officers, investigators, and administrative staff were hovering near the hallways, their faces a mixture of professional stoicism and profound disbelief. The name Elias Thorne had been a fixture in the local educational community for so long that his arrest felt less like a police action and more like an act of sacrilege against the very idea of public trust. As they walked him through the sterile, white-tiled corridors, the harsh overhead lighting seemed to strip away the illusion of the grandfather, revealing the contours of a man who had successfully performed a life for decades. They didn't put him in a holding cell. They brought him directly to the interview room, a small, windowless box with a metal table, a single camera tucked into the corner, and a sense of impending, suffocating judgment. Detective Sarah Miller, the lead investigator who had spearheaded the genetic genealogy breakthrough, sat across from him. She had spent 2 years obsessing over the Jenkins file, living with the faces of the victim and the suspect in her mind until they felt like part of her own family. She looked at Elias, this frail, silver-haired man, and tried to reconcile the image of the beloved grandfather with the savage brutality that the evidence suggested. "Elias," she began, her voice steady, stripped of the performative aggression often seen in such interrogations. "We have the results. We have the profile. We have the match that traces back not just to a name, but to a life that you've been building on a foundation of silence for 41 years. The question is no longer who did this. The question is why, and who else knows the weight of what you've been carrying." Elias looked up, his eyes meeting hers for the first time, and Miller caught a glimpse of something that chilled her to the bone. Not the fear of an innocent man wrongfully accused, but the weary, resigned look of a soldier who had finally lost his war. He shifted in his chair, the metal screeching against the floor, a jarring sound in the heavy silence. "You think you know," he whispered, his voice dry, sounding like wind over brittle leaves. "You think this is about a single night in November, about a girl you never met, about a life you've reconstructed from paper and digital ghosts. But you don't know the erosion of the soul. You don't know how a life becomes a performance, day after day, until you can't even remember the person you were before the mask took root. You're looking for a monster, detective, but all you have is a man who learned how to be invisible in a room full of people." The interrogation room became a stage for a slow, psychological autopsy of a 40-year lie. Miller pushed for details, for the sequence of events that had led to that fateful night in 1994, but Elias retreated, his answers elliptical and evasive. He spoke of the pressures of his career, the suffocating expectations of the community, and the way the city of Boston had felt like a pressure cooker in the early 90s, but he skirted the violence. He didn't want to talk about the road, the car, or the darkness of the marsh. He wanted to talk about the construction of his life, about how he had carefully selected a spouse who was quiet and unsuspecting, how he had doted on his children to ensure they would become shields against any potential scrutiny, how he had become a pillar of the local church just to be beyond reproach. It was a masterclass in sociopathic adaptation, a confession of a life lived as a defensive fortification against the memory of a crime that he had committed with the casual, impulsive brutality of a man who believed the world was beneath him. Outside the station, the city of Boston was beginning to wake up to the news, and the initial, tentative reports were quickly ballooning into a national scandal. News crews were setting up camp on the lawn of the Thorne residence, their cables snaking across the perfectly manicured grass where Elias had spent hundreds of hours tending to his rose bushes. His family, completely blindsided, were in the eye of a hurricane, their private grief and confusion compounded by the blinding glare of public scrutiny. The irony was almost too sharp to bear. The man who had preached the values of honesty and integrity to his grandchildren was the same man who had been living a lie since before they were born. The local media was having a field day, the phrase "beloved grandfather arrested at his 80th birthday" becoming the definitive, inescapable headline of the week, a punchline to a tragedy that was only just beginning to be understood. Inside the department, Miller and her team were cross-referencing the interrogation notes with the historical archives of the case. They found that in 1994, Elias Thorne had actually been on a short list of potential interviewees, but because his alibi, provided by his wife, had been consistent and his reputation was sterling, he had been quietly discarded. It was one of those devastating near misses that define the history of cold cases. The killer had been standing right there, inside the radius of the investigation, shielded by the sheer weight of his own perceived goodness. Miller read the original detective's notes, a frantic scrawl in black ink that read, "Thorne is a family man, deeply involved in the school district, no record of violence, clearly not a suspect." That single sentence had granted a predator an extra 4 decades of freedom, a lifetime of normalcy that Sarah Jenkins had been denied in the span of a few violent minutes. The psychological toll on the investigating team was profound. They were tired, their eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, but they were fueled by a sense of duty that transcended the exhaustion. They knew that the public was waiting for the answer, and they also knew that the answer was not going to be a simple, neat narrative. Elias was not a serial offender in the traditional sense. He wasn't a man who had spent years hunting. He was a man who had committed an act of impulsive, selfish horror and then spent the rest of his life ensuring he would never have to face the music. This, in many ways, was more terrifying than the classic depiction of a killer because it suggested that the capacity for such darkness exists not just in the shadows, but in the heart of the most ordinary, respectable people. As the morning hours dragged on, Miller realized that the strategy of the interview needed to shift. She couldn't force Elias to recount the crime. She had to force him to reckon with the life he had stolen. She placed a photo of Sarah Jenkins, a bright, laughing student in her nursing school uniform, on the table. She didn't say a word. She just watched as Elias stared at the photograph, his composure wavering for the first time. For a few seconds, the mask was gone, and beneath it was not a hardened criminal, but a scared, tired old man who was finally, definitively facing the person he had erased from existence. It was the most pivotal moment of the interrogation, the point at which the defensive walls began to crack, the silence of 40 years finally starting to fray at the edges. "She was 22, Elias," Miller said, her voice soft but insistent. "She was just starting. She had a family who loved her. She had a future. You took all of that, and for 41 years, you've been living on the time you stole from her. Every birthday, every holiday, every moment you spent with your children and grandchildren, that was all stolen, every single bit of it. You lived a full, rich life, while her life was rotting in a marsh. How do you live with that? How do you look in the mirror every morning and see anything other than what you did to her?" Elias's hands, which had been perfectly still for the duration of the interview, suddenly began to shake. He looked at the camera in the corner, then back at Miller, his face a landscape of regret that felt less like genuine remorse and more like a crushing, existential defeat. "I didn't think about her," he whispered, a tear tracing a path through the deep lines of his aged skin. "That's the secret, isn't it? You don't think about the person. You think about the situation. You think about how to fix it, how to bury it, how to survive. You spend 40 years perfecting the silence, and you become the silence. I wasn't Elias Thorne, the administrator. I was the secret. And today, the secret finally killed the man." The confession wasn't explosive. It was a slow, agonizing dissolution of identity. He started to describe that night, the cold in the air, the way the frost had covered the windows of his car, the brief, horrific encounter on the highway. He spoke of the fear, not for Sarah, but for himself, the terror of being seen, of being found out, of losing the life he had built. It was a selfish, small, and utterly pathetic confession, but it was the truth, and it was devastating in its simplicity. Miller took notes, her hand cramping, her heart racing as she captured the details that would ensure a conviction. The room felt smaller, the air thinner, as the weight of the last 4 decades settled into the corners, filling the space with the suffocating reality of the crime. As the interview concluded, the gravity of the case had clearly shifted. They had the confession, they had the DNA, and they had the psychological portrait of a killer who had used his own humanity as a camouflage for his depravity. But as Elias was led back to the holding area, Miller looked at the photo of Sarah Jenkins one more time and wondered if the justice they were about to serve would ever be enough. They had solved the case, but the stain of what had happened, the lost time, the shattered innocence, and the decades of unanswered questions would always remain. The city of Boston would soon know the truth, the public would react with horror and anger, and the name Elias Thorne would be forever synonymous with one of the most chilling, well-kept secrets in the city's history. But for the team that had cracked the case, the victory felt bittersweet, a grim reminder of how long the shadow of a single violent act can stretch across time, and how easily we can be fooled by the faces of those we see every day, assuming the best while the worst hides in plain sight. The interrogation room door clicked shut, the sound echoing like a gavel stroke in the stark, industrial silence of the precinct. Elias Thorne was now officially a prisoner of his own history, his status as a beloved grandfather stripped away, replaced by the clinical, objective designation of a prime suspect in a cold case homicide. Detective Sarah Miller stood by the observation window, watching him sit on the metal bench, his shoulders hunched, his hands resting on his knees, as if he were waiting for a school bell to ring. But there was no bell for Elias. There was only the cold, unyielding reality of the evidence locker, where the artifacts of his past were currently being reprocessed with a level of scrutiny that would have been impossible in 1994. The shift in his demeanor, from the practiced, gentle mask of a retiree to the hollow, vacant stare of a man who had finally been unmasked, was as sudden as it was terrifying. Back in the archives of the Boston Police Department, the physical evidence was being treated like sacred, volatile relics. The box labeled Jenkins, Sarah, November 14th, 94 was currently the most guarded item in the entire building. Inside, the items were a testament to the limitations of forensic science 32 years ago. There was the steering wheel cover that had been stripped from the car, the driver's side door handle, and a handful of personal effects that had been found scattered in the snow at the edge of the marsh. Miller knew that the prosecution's case would hinge on the connection between these items and the man currently sitting in the holding cell. She walked into the evidence lab, the air humming with the sound of high-end sequencing machines, to consult with the lead forensic analyst, Dr. Eris Thorne, a man whose meticulous nature was the perfect foil to the chaotic, messy reality of a 32-year-old murder. "The secondary analysis is coming back, Sarah," Dr. Thorne said, not looking up from the monitor that displayed an intricate, cascading web of genetic sequences. "The match isn't just consistent. It's definitive. We've isolated markers that have essentially remained unchanged since the late 90s. We also found trace amounts of organic material, microscopic fibers, on the steering wheel that matched the material of a high-end, wool-blend cardigan that Elias Thorne was wearing in a series of family photos taken in the winter of 1994. It's an overlap of data that isn't just damning, it's impossible to ignore." Miller felt a shiver run down her spine. The elegance of the science was the exact opposite of the ugliness of the crime. The fact that a man could live an entire life, raise children, and become a fixture of his community, while the very fibers of his existence were etched onto the site of a murder, was a haunting reminder of how fragile, yet how revealing, the physical world really is. Meanwhile, the media storm outside the station had reached a fever pitch. News vans were double-parked on every side street, their satellite dishes pointed toward the sky like jagged, mechanical trees. The story of the grandfather murderer had gone viral, the narrative shifting from a local crime report to a national obsession with the monster next door. Reporters were digging into Elias's past, finding the same, unremarkable details that had blinded everyone in the first place. His perfect attendance record at work, his reputation for being the nicest man in the neighborhood, his active participation in the local arts council. It was a classic, jarring dissonance, a public image so sanitized and perfect that it had acted as a protective layer, insulating him from the kind of scrutiny that would have broken a lesser, more obviously troubled man. Inside his home, now a cordoned-off crime scene, federal and local investigators were performing a forensic sweep of the property. They weren't looking for a murder weapon, as 32 years was far too long for that, but they were looking for the trophies of a predator, the small, seemingly insignificant items that killers often keep to tether themselves to their crimes. They sifted through the basement, the attic, and the carefully organized garage, looking for any scrap of evidence that would prove that Sarah Jenkins wasn't the only ghost Elias Thorne was keeping. The silence of the house was absolute. The rooms frozen in the state they were left in when the tactical team burst through the door. A birthday cake sat on the kitchen counter, half-eaten, a surreal reminder of the normal life that had been interrupted by the long-overdue arrival of justice. The investigation into Elias's past was also revealing a complex, hidden life. While the public knew him as the administrator who could solve any budget crisis or school policy dispute, his private life was a series of meticulously managed interactions. He had moved through Boston social circles like a ghost, never staying in one place too long, never engaging in any activity that would draw attention to his personal habits. He had been a master of the long con, a man who treated his entire life as a performance. Interviews with his former colleagues revealed that he had been viewed as aloof and private, traits that were often overlooked in a man of his stature, but in the light of the recent confession, they took on a much more sinister tone. He hadn't been aloof, he had been hiding. He hadn't been private, he had been erasing his footprint. As the afternoon dragged on, Miller returned to the interrogation room to see Elias. She didn't want a confession anymore. She had enough for a conviction. She wanted the truth of the night. She wanted to understand the sequence, the motivation, and the precise moment when a man of his standing had decided to cross the line into the unthinkable. Elias looked older, the fluorescent lights of the room accentuating the deep, weary lines in his face. He didn't look up when Miller sat down. "She didn't fight at first," he whispered, his voice so quiet that Miller had to lean in to hear him. "She thought I was someone who was trying to help. Her car had died on the shoulder, and it was so cold, the kind of cold that turns the air into glass. She was so grateful. She thanked me for stopping. That was the start of the lie. The lie that I was a hero, a helper, a decent man." Miller gripped her pen, her knuckles white. She listened as Elias, in a tone that was chillingly detached, began to detail the final moments of Sarah Jenkins. He didn't describe her with the language of a villain, but with the chilling, clinical precision of an administrator detailing a failed project. He spoke of the engine's sputter, the way the headlights hit the snow, the feeling of absolute, intoxicating power that he felt when he realized he was in control. It wasn't about her, he said, his eyes finally flickering to Miller's. It was about the shift in reality. For that hour, for that night, I wasn't just a man in a school district office. I was the person who decided what happened next. I think I just wanted to see if I could do it and never be caught. I wanted to see if I was smarter than the world. The revelation was as devastating as it was simple. There was no grand conspiracy, no twisted ideological motive, no underlying psychological trauma that could explain it. It was the arrogance of a man who believed he was above the moral laws that governed the rest of humanity, a man who viewed his own life as a chess game where the other pieces were expendable. As he spoke, Miller realized that the beloved grandfather was a myth not because Elias had changed, but because the world had never bothered to look past the surface. He had committed the ultimate crime out of boredom and a God complex, and then spent 3 decades building a life of virtue to prove that he was untouchable. As the sun began to set over the city, casting the streets of Boston in a long, bruised shadow, Miller exited the room, feeling as though she had been submerged in water. The weight of the case was now shifting from the investigative phase to the legal, as the DA's office began to draft the indictment. The public outcry for the death penalty, or at least for the maximum life sentence, was already building, with the Jenkins family finally speaking to the press in a series of tearful, heart-wrenching interviews. They were no longer the forgotten family of a cold case. They were the focal point of a national reckoning. The life of Sarah Jenkins, once a statistic, was being reclaimed, her name the catalyst for the ultimate destruction of a man who had thought he could escape the gravity of his own actions. The night air in the city felt different now. The case had been solved, the mystery broken, but the sense of unease that had settled over Boston would take much longer to disperse. Every time someone looked at a teacher, a neighbor, or a grandfather, they would now wonder, what is the secret behind the mask? Elias Thorne had become the personification of a societal fear, the fear that the safety we take for granted is a fragile construct, easily shattered by the very people who claim to uphold it. The case was solved, but the questions it raised about trust, identity, and the darkness that can persist beneath a lifetime of goodness would continue to echo through the city long after the trial had ended and the news vans had packed up their gear. The silence of the marsh had finally been broken, but the sound of the truth was even more unsettling than the quiet that had come before it. The pretrial hearing for the state of Massachusetts versus Elias Thorne was not merely a legal proceeding, it was a public purging of a collective shame that had festered in the heart of Boston for over 30 years. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was electric, a volatile mixture of grief, righteous fury, and the morbid curiosity of a public that had been systematically lied to by the very man they had once heralded as a saint. Judge Catherine Vance, a woman known for her icy composure and absolute intolerance for theatrics, presided over a room so packed that the oxygen seemed to thin, leaving the air heavy with the scent of old wood, floor polish, and the suffocating tension of long-delayed reckoning. Elias Thorne, now stripped of the dignity of his home life and reduced to the sterile gray of a prison jumpsuit, sat slumped at the defense table, his head bowed, his hands folded in his lap, a tableau of performative contrition that the gallery viewed with visceral, unadulterated loathing. Richard Sterling, Thorne's high-profile defense attorney, began the proceedings not by arguing the facts of the crime, which he knew were backed by the unassailable fortress of DNA evidence, but by attempting to frame the entire investigation as a psychological and procedural overreach. He paced the courtroom with the deliberate rhythm of a predator, his voice a smooth, calculated baritone that aimed to dissect the integrity of the evidence collected in 1994. "What we are witnessing here, Your Honor," Sterling boomed, his hand gesturing toward the silent, slumped figure of his client, "is a modern-day inquisition. The state has decided that because a decades-old file was stagnant, they needed a sacrifice, and they found one in an elderly man whose only crime was a quiet, unassuming life that made him an easy target for their forensic theater. It was a bold, albeit predictable, gambit, an attempt to discredit the very science that had brought the case to its knees. But the prosecution, led by the unflinching District Attorney Marcus Thorne, had anticipated every pivot, every deflection, and every attempt to rewrite the narrative of the last 32 years. As Miller took the stand, her testimony became the fulcrum upon which the entire hearing balanced. She didn't rely on sentiment or dramatic flourish. She laid out the timeline with the cold, rhythmic precision of a ticking clock. She walked the court through the 1994 disappearance of Sarah Jenkins, the initial failure of the investigation, the preservation of the evidence, and the painstaking, month-long process of genealogical reconstruction that had finally, inevitably, led them to the grandfather in the suburban home. Every detail, from the specific tread of the tires reported by a witness in '94 to the microscopic skin cells recovered from the car handle, was presented as a facet of an unbreakable diamond. The most shocking moment of the hearing came when the prosecution introduced a series of audio recordings recovered from a digital storage device found during the secondary search of Thorne's attic. They weren't recordings of the crime. Thorne had been far too cautious for that, but they were the recorded, private journals of a man who had been living a fractured, dual existence. In a voice that was clearly Thorne's, the recordings detailed his observations of the community, his interactions at the school district, and, with chilling detachment, his thoughts on the art of disappearing in plain sight. He spoke of how easy it was to manipulate the perceptions of his neighbors, how he could witness the aftermath of the Sarah Jenkins search and feel not guilt, but a profound, perverse sense of intellectual superiority. The courtroom went deathly silent as the audio played, the voice of the beloved grandfather sounding, in the context of his own admissions, like a hollow, mechanical mockery of human empathy. The defense attorney's face went pale as the audio played, the recording effectively dismantling his argument of a wrongfully accused elderly man. Sterling struggled to find a foothold, his objections becoming increasingly frantic, but the damage was irreversible. Thorne, meanwhile, didn't move. He remained a statue of gray fabric and bowed head, though those watching him closely noted the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers dug into the fabric of his jumpsuit. The myth of the man who had been the victim of forensic theater had been incinerated in the span of 12 minutes of audio. He wasn't a target of a political agenda. He was a master of his own deception, a man who had kept his secret not because he was innocent, but because he was arrogant enough to believe that he had outsmarted the timeline of human mortality. As the hearing broke for a brief, frantic recess, the courthouse corridors erupted into a chaotic confluence of legal analysts, journalists, and family members. The Jenkins family, who had spent their lives in the shadows of an unsolved mystery, were finally at the center of the world's attention. Sarah's mother, now in her late 70s, stood before a wall of cameras, her voice trembling not with fragility, but with the searing, tempered steel of decades of resolve. "We didn't need to hear him speak to know who he was," she said, her gaze unwavering. "We felt the absence of our daughter every single day for 32 years. He spent those years building a legacy. We spent them building a ghost. Today, the ghost finally has a name, and the name belongs to a coward." The sentiment resonated through the city, turning the public sentiment from speculative curiosity into a unified, singular demand for the absolute maximum penalty the law could provide. The second half of the hearing shifted into the technical details of the DNA match. The prosecution called Dr. Eris Thorne back to the stand, a man who had become the hero of the forensic world for his role in the case. He explained the nature of the cold hit, how the database had identified not a match for Elias, but for a distant cousin, and how that initial strand of information had been pulled and teased until the entire family tree had been unmasked. It was a terrifying, brilliant display of the power of modern biology, turning the private, genetic heritage of a single family into a public, inescapable instrument of justice. For the defense, there was nothing left to do but watch as the final, absolute proof of their client's guilt was laid out in high-definition projections of genetic markers that the jury could not possibly misinterpret. As the day bled into evening, the judge finally called for a wrap-up, the final arguments of the day leaving a sense of irrevocable change in the room. Elias Thorne was being processed for return to the holding cell, and as he stood, he caught the eyes of the family in the gallery. For a split second, the mask of the stoic, bowed grandfather vanished, and a flicker of something raw and desperate, not of remorse, but of genuine, naked fear, flashed across his face. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that his careful, managed existence had been permanently extinguished. The life he had curated, the reputation he had guarded, and the community he had manipulated were all gone, replaced by the crushing, inevitable reality of the cell that awaited him. He was a man who had lived in the future he had built for himself, and now, that future had been stripped away, leaving him to face the only thing he had truly avoided for 3 decades, the truth. The atmosphere outside, in the sprawling, cool dark of a Boston evening, was one of profound relief mixed with a lingering, unsettling question. The case was being resolved, the killer had been caught, and the truth had finally been spoken. Yet the city felt different. Every suburban porch light, every quiet school building, and every familiar, aging face in the neighborhood suddenly carried a different weight. The Thorne case had proven that the most dangerous secrets aren't kept in the shadows, but in the light, hidden by the very social structures we use to define our safety. It was a lesson that Boston would carry for a long, long time. The realization that the monster you fear is often the one who is smiling at you, holding your hand, and telling you that everything is going to be all right, while he is secretly counting down the seconds until he can return to the silence of his own dark design. As the night settled, the legal team retreated to their offices, the exhaustion of the process beginning to take its toll, yet there was no sleep to be had. The case was moving into the final stages, and every move had to be calculated to perfection. Detective Miller sat at her office, the light of her monitor the only illumination in the room, and looked over the last of the files. The case was solved, but the story was still unfolding. The question of how Elias had managed to remain unseen for so long, and whether there were other, smaller, less perfect crimes he had committed in the margins of his life, was beginning to gnaw at the edges of the investigation. The hearing had resolved the Jenkins mystery, but it had opened a doorway into the mind of a man who had been a master of his own reality for 40 years, and the journey into that darkness, Miller realized, was only just beginning. The finality of the court session wasn't the end of the narrative. It was simply the end of the prologue. The true, agonizing depth of the life of Elias Thorne remained, waiting in the silence, for the trial to begin. The courtroom doors swung open for the second week of trial, the atmosphere now charged with a visceral, suffocating gravity. If the initial hearings were about establishing the how of the case, this phase was dedicated to the why, a deep, harrowing dive into the fractured psychology of Elias Thorne. The prosecution had decided to abandon the veil of procedural technicality and instead subject the jury to the raw, unfiltered reality of the man who had occupied their community as a harmless administrator while harboring the soul of a predator. As Elias Thorne was led to his seat, he no longer held the posture of a quiet, defeated old man. He sat with a rigid, almost clinical stillness, his eyes fixed on the mahogany bench, as if he were an observer at his own trial, a detached entity watching the demolition of a life he had once painstakingly constructed. District Attorney Marcus Thorne, no relation to the defendant, opened the day by calling Dr. Eris Thorne, the forensic psychiatrist who had spent over 60 hours in direct, intense observation of the accused. The courtroom hung on every word. Dr. Thorne, a man with a reputation for being as unflappable as he was meticulous, painted a portrait of a personality that was not merely sociopathic, but profoundly, terrifyingly adaptive. What we are looking at, he testified, his voice echoing in the rafters of the historic building, is a master of mimetic behavior. Elias Thorne didn't just pretend to be a good man. He studied the social cues of goodness and implemented them with the precision of a computer program. He was not a man driven by sudden, uncontrollable rage. He was a man driven by a profound, hollow sense of entitlement, the belief that his intelligence allowed him to transcend the moral boundaries that constrained the rest of society. He killed not because he was broken, but because he believed he was a god who could carve his own rules into the landscape of Boston. The jury, a diverse cross-section of the city, seemed visibly shaken by the clinical tone of the diagnosis. They were looking for a monster with claws, but they were being presented with a man who could easily have been their grandfather, their principal, or the kindly man who gave them directions at the park. The defense attorney, Richard Sterling, stood to cross-examine, his voice crackling with the desperate energy of a man who knew he was losing the war. He attempted to paint the doctor's assessment as speculative fiction, a dangerous, academic reduction of a human life into a bundle of diagnostic traits. But his efforts fell flat. The sheer weight of the evidence, the audio journals, the DNA match, the corroborated timeline, made the doctor's testimony feel less like an opinion and more like an autopsy report of a living man. The prosecution then shifted its focus to the specific timeline of the weeks leading up to Sarah Jenkins's disappearance in November of 1994. They produced a series of forgotten credit card statements, phone logs from the old-school district office, and library checkout records that had been salvaged from an off-site, forgotten archive. They mapped Thorne's movements in the days preceding the abduction with a chilling, cinematic clarity. He had been casing the nursing school where Sarah studied, his car logged in the faculty parking lot on 3 separate occasions when he had no official business there. It was a methodical hunt, a predator gathering intelligence on his prey with the same level of care he brought to his professional responsibilities. The jury was shown images of a younger Elias Thorne, his face framed in the cold, grainy aesthetic of 90s surveillance footage, looking almost identical to the man sitting just 20 feet away from them. It was during this presentation that the first cracks in Thorne's facade finally appeared. As the prosecutor described the way he had approached Sarah on that freezing November night, offering to help her with her car, Thorne leaned forward, his hands trembling violently. For a brief, agonizing moment, he looked up and caught the eye of Sarah Jenkins's mother in the front row. The look wasn't one of apology. It was one of raw, unadulterated fear, the realization that the secret he had guarded for 32 years had been stripped of its power. He was no longer the man in control. He was a relic of a discarded past, a man being dismantled in real time by the very society he had fooled for 4 decades. The moment passed, but the tension in the room remained, the air thick with the silent, collective weight of what he had taken. The prosecution's next witness was a retired colleague of Thorne's, a woman who had worked under him in the late 80s. She took the stand, her voice wavering, and described an incident where Thorne had been unexpectedly cruel, a verbal outburst that had stunned the office, followed by an immediate, terrifying reversion to his gentle, professional persona. It was like watching a switch, she testified. One moment, he was the kindest person I had ever met, someone who would go out of his way to help with a personal crisis, and then, in a blink, he was cold, dismissive, and utterly devoid of anything resembling warmth. It lasted only a second, and then he was back. I told myself I had imagined it, that I was just tired because he was such a good man. Everyone said he was such a good man. I believed it because I needed to believe it. This testimony, more than any forensic evidence, seemed to deeply impact the jury. They were beginning to see the mechanism of the mask. It wasn't that Thorne was hiding in the shadows. It was that he was hiding in the blinding light of social expectation. He had successfully manipulated the natural human tendency to believe the best in those we are socialized to trust. The trial became, in many ways, an indictment of the community's own complacency. They had been too blinded by his resume, his age, and his gentle demeanor to look for the cracks in the armor. Thorne's defense team tried to object, arguing that character testimony from 30 years ago was irrelevant and inflammatory, but the judge overruled, noting that it went directly to the defendant's pattern of behavioral compartmentalization. As the day's proceedings came to an end, the intensity in the courtroom reached a fever pitch. A reporter from one of the major networks whispered to a colleague that this was the most chilling trial in the history of the Commonwealth. Thorne was let out, his walk slower than before, his head still bowed but his shoulders visibly sagging. He looked like a man who had seen the end of his own world. Back in the holding cell, he refused his meal, sitting in the corner, staring at the concrete wall. The guards reported that he had begun to mutter to himself, a low, rhythmic sound that was impossible to decipher. The man who had been the master of his own reality was finally being consumed by the reality he had created. The city of Boston, meanwhile, was experiencing a profound shift in tone. The shock of the arrest had given way to a deep, contemplative sadness. The trial was forcing the entire metropolitan area to look at the structures of their own lives, the people they called neighbors, the institutions they called safe, the elders they called beloved. It was a reckoning that went far beyond the murder of a single nursing student. It was a societal confrontation with the possibility that the perfect life is often just the most efficient disguise. As the trial prepared to move into its final, most damning phase, the city braced itself for the evidence that would officially connect the dots between the grandfather in the suburban home and the killer of the marsh. The truth was no longer a secret, but a living, breathing weight, and the courtroom was the anvil upon which it was being forged into a permanent, undeniable history. Every piece of evidence, every witness testimony, and every hour of trial was building toward the final confrontation, the moment when the mask would be ripped away for good, and the man who had lived in the shadow of his own lie would finally have to stand in the harsh, uncompromising light of justice. The trial was far from over, but the outcome had already been written in the silent, cold language of DNA, and the final judgment was fast approaching. The courtroom felt smaller, more claustrophobic, as the sixth day of the trial dawned with a heavy, leaden sky pressing down on the Boston skyline. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the nervous energy of an audience that knew today would be the turning point. The prosecution's strategy was clear. They had dismantled the mask, they had analyzed the psychology, and now they were going to reconstruct the anatomy of the crime itself. Detective Sarah Miller took the stand once more, but this time, the purpose was to guide the jury through the forensic reconstruction of November 14, 1994. The prosecutor, Marcus Thorne, projected a series of intricate, computer-generated models onto the large screens that lined the courtroom, showing the path of Sarah Jenkins's car, the weather conditions, and the exact placement of the forensic markers found at the scene 32 years later. We are not here to talk about who Elias Thorne became in the decades that followed. Marcus Thorne began, his voice dropping into a register of somber, precise gravity. We are here to talk about who he was on that night. We are here to talk about the man who stood in the freezing rain, watched a 22-year-old student struggle with a dying engine, and made the decision that her life was something he could simply discard, like a broken tool in a workshop. He pointed to the screen, where the model depicted the desolate stretch of road. The defense has tried to claim that the evidence was contaminated, that the timeline was stretched, and that the identity of the perpetrator is a case of mistaken scientific assumption. But science does not make mistakes when the data is this precise. Miller's testimony was the anchor of the presentation. She described the exact state of the steering wheel cover, how the skin cells were not merely present, but embedded in the synthetic grain of the material. She explained the process of how they had used the newly refined touch DNA analysis to extract a profile so robust that it could not be dismissed as a transfer from a casual encounter. "When we processed the steering wheel cover," Miller said, her voice echoing in the chamber, "we weren't just looking for DNA. We were looking for a history of contact. The pattern of the cells, the density of the biological material, and the location of the residue all suggest a violent, sustained gripping. Someone held that wheel with force. Someone was trying to stop her from leaving, or perhaps trying to force her to go somewhere she didn't want to go." As Miller spoke, the camera in the courtroom panned to Elias Thorne. He was no longer looking at the bench. He was staring at the projections on the screen. His face was a mask of cold, agonizing recognition. He wasn't looking at a model. He was looking at a ghost of himself, a man he had spent half his life pretending hadn't existed. For a moment, his eyes met Miller's, and the look he gave her was not one of defiance, but of a profound, hollow exhaustion. It was the look of a man who realized that he had spent his entire life building a cathedral of reputation, only to have the foundation crumble beneath the weight of a single, microscopic truth. The prosecution then called a forensic collision reconstruction expert, a man who had spent his career analyzing the physics of vehicle breakdowns and, consequently, the tactical advantages of feigned mechanical failure. He testified about the specific type of ignition tampering that would cause a car like the one Sarah Jenkins drove to stall in the exact way it had. "It isn't a random event," he testified. "To stall a car with such precision, to make it look like a battery failure or an alternator issue while ensuring the vehicle could not be restarted by the driver, that requires a specific, intimate knowledge of auto mechanics. You have to know where to pull the wire, how to hide the bypass, and how to make the car seem dead. It is a calculated, predatory tactic." The defense attorney, Richard Sterling, stood to object, his arguments becoming increasingly shrill, focusing on the speculative nature of the mechanical analysis. But the judge, her patience visibly thinning, overruled every single one. The courtroom was moving past the realm of doubt and into the realm of mathematical certainty. The evidence was no longer just a collection of items. It was a narrative of intent. The jury watched, captivated and increasingly horrified, as the prosecution pieced together the sequence: the stalking, the mechanical sabotage, the feigned offer of assistance, and the inevitable, violent abduction. It was a sequence that made the beloved grandfather, persona, look not just like a lie, but like an active, malicious construction designed to protect a predator in plain sight. During the afternoon session, the prosecution dropped the final, devastating piece of evidence: a diary entry from a long-lost pocket calendar belonging to Sarah Jenkins, recovered by a local resident from the marshland nearly 3 decades later and turned in only after the arrest of Thorne made the news. The entry was short, dated the week before her disappearance. It mentioned a helpful man at the local auto parts store who had helped her fix a tire, a man who had been too polite, almost suspiciously so. The jury read the words, the handwritten script projected in massive, blown-up format on the courtroom wall. The man in the diary entry fit the description of Elias Thorne at the age of 48 to the letter. The courtroom erupted in a low, collective gasp. Thorne's defense team looked as though they had been physically struck. The diary entry was the missing link, a documented, contemporaneous record of the predator testing his prey, marking his territory, and setting the trap that would eventually lead to the night of November 14th. Thorne, finally, seemed to break. He let out a ragged, uneven breath and slumped forward, his head resting on the table. It was the first sign of visible, genuine surrender. The mask hadn't just slipped, it had been shattered by the handwriting of the woman he had destroyed. The jury members looked at each other, their faces hardened by the realization that they were witnessing the final act of a lifetime of deception. As the day reached its conclusion, the atmosphere in the room shifted from the technical to the emotional. The prosecutor ended the day by speaking not about science, but about Sarah. He recounted the dreams she had had, the nursing program she had been set to finish, and the life that had been permanently curtailed by the man sitting at the defense table. He didn't ask for pity. He asked for the truth. The defense wants you to look at an old man in a gray jumpsuit, the prosecutor said, his voice quiet, steady, and filled with a controlled rage. "I want you to look at the man who chose to take a life and then spent 32 years building a house of lies to make sure he never had to answer for it. He didn't just kill her, he erased her. He spent his life erasing her. And now, the time for erasure is over." The session was adjourned, but the weight of the day's testimony hung in the air long after the doors closed. The journalists scrambled to get their final soundbites, the legal analysts prepared for the late-night talk shows, and the city of Boston tried to process the reality of what had been laid out on the record. Thorne was transported back to the holding facility, but he was a different man than he had been in the morning. He was no longer a person. He was a relic of a failed project, a man whose life had been dissected and found wanting in every possible dimension. The jury was ushered away, their faces stoic and serious, the task ahead of them clearly defined by the evidence that now filled the room. That night, in the quiet of his cell, Thorne did not sleep. The guards reported that he had spent the night sitting on the floor, staring at the small, narrow strip of moonlight that fell across his cot. The diary entry, those simple, handwritten words, had undone everything. He knew, with a certainty that had eluded him for 40 years, that the verdict was no longer a question of if, but how soon. The arrogance that had sustained his life of performative virtue had been replaced by the cold, absolute clarity of the end. He had been a man who thought he could control his legacy, who believed he could rewrite the narrative of his existence through a lifetime of charity and professional success. But he had forgotten the most basic truth, that the past does not simply go away. It waits. It hides in the archives, in the fibers of a steering wheel, in the margins of a forgotten diary. It waits for the moment when the truth can no longer be contained, and then, with the force of an oncoming storm, it comes to collect. The trial was far from over, but the courtroom had already made its judgment. The man who had been known to his neighbors as a pillar of the community had been revealed as a calculated, cold-blooded killer. The trial would continue. There would be more testimonies, more arguments, and more attempts by the defense to argue for leniency, but the reality of the situation had been solidified. The name Elias Thorne had been stripped of its layers of respectability, and all that remained was the truth, a truth that was as ugly, as simple, and as damning as the crime itself. The shadow of 1994 had finally been brought into the light, and for the first time in 32 years, the city of Boston knew exactly who had been living in its midst. The long-delayed reckoning had begun, and there was nothing left to do but watch it run its course to the final, inevitable conclusion.
Part 7.
The courtroom doors opened to a scene that had become hauntingly familiar. The relentless flash of cameras, the murmur of the gallery, and the suffocating tension that seemed to vibrate in the very architecture of the building. But today, the atmosphere was different. There was no more mystery to be peeled back, no more layers of deception to be stripped away. Today, the trial of Elias Thorne entered its final, most devastating phase, the victim impact statements. The prosecution had requested that this portion be treated with absolute, uninterrupted solemnity, a direct confrontation between the architect of the crime and the family he had spent 32 years haunting. As Elias Thorne was let in, his steps were slower, his frame appearing to shrink within the oversized gray fabric of his jumpsuit. He did not look at the gallery. He kept his eyes on the floor, the picture of a man who had finally been hollowed out by the weight of his own revealed history. The first to take the stand was Sarah Jenkins's brother, David, a man who had grown up in the shadow of his sister's disappearance, his life marked by the annual, agonizing anniversaries that Elias Thorne had spent in the comfort of his own home. David walked to the witness stand, his gait heavy, his expression a mask of tempered, disciplined rage. He carried a small, worn leather journal, Sarah's, that had been recovered at the very start of the investigation, a relic of a life that had been cut short at the precipice of adulthood. He did not speak to the judge, nor did he look at the jury. He turned his body completely toward the defense table, his eyes locking onto Elias Thorne with intensity that forced the older man to finally, reluctantly, lift his head. "I spent my entire childhood wondering what happened to you, Sarah," David began, his voice surprisingly steady, cutting through the silence of the room like a physical blade. I spent my teenage years wondering if the person who did this was watching us, laughing at us. I grew into a man. I got married. I had children of my own, and every single one of those moments was punctuated by the knowledge that my sister was nowhere, that she had been stolen by a coward who was playing at being a human being. He took a breath, his fingers tightening around the edge of the podium. And all that time you were there. You were living in our city. You were working in our schools. You were standing in the same lines at the grocery store, breathing the same air, pretending that you were a pillar of the community, while my sister's remains were left in the cold marshland you dragged her into. Thorne flinched, a small, involuntary movement of the shoulders. It was the first time in the entire trial he had displayed a physical reaction to the words directed at him. David didn't stop. "You didn't just kill my sister," he continued, his voice rising, his eyes brimming with the unshed tears of 32 years of grief. "You killed our peace. You killed our ability to trust. You turned our lives into a search for an answer that you held in your pocket like a sick, twisted trophy. You thought you were smarter than us. You thought that because we couldn't see you, you were invisible. But you were never invisible. You were just a monster who was terrified of being seen." When David finished his statement, he didn't leave the stand immediately. He remained there, holding Elias Thorne's gaze, a silent testament to the endurance of the victim's family. The courtroom was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. Thorne was visibly trembling now, his hands gripping the table so hard his knuckles had turned a stark, unnatural white. It was the moment of absolute, total collapse, the moment when the carefully constructed facade of the beloved grandfather was finally incinerated by the sheer, unadulterated reality of the pain he had caused. He wasn't a pillar of the community. He was a man who had been defined by a single, cowardly act of violence, and he was being forced, finally, to look at the consequences of that choice. The prosecution then called Sarah's mother, Martha Jenkins, to the stand. Her testimony was not a speech of rage, but a quiet, agonizing recount of the day she had been told her daughter was missing. She spoke of the police cars arriving, the lights, the confusion, and the 32 years of not knowing. She described the empty bedroom that had remained exactly as Sarah left it for a decade, a monument to a girl who was never coming home. She didn't look at Thorne. She didn't need to. Her focus was entirely on the memory of her daughter, a life that had been brimming with potential, a life that Thorne had extinguished out of a petty, selfish desire for control. "I don't hate you," she said, her voice a fragile, paper-thin whisper. "Hate is a feeling that requires respect. I don't respect you. You are a footnote. You are a mistake that the law has finally corrected." The impact of these statements on the jury was palpable. Several of the jurors were openly weeping, their faces hardened not by confusion, but by a sudden, sharp clarity about the gravity of the man's actions. The defense attorney, Richard Sterling, had remained seated during the statements, his usual aggressive posture now limp. He knew that any attempt to object or interrupt would only serve to paint his client in a worse light. He was watching the demolition of his client's legal and moral standing in real time, the narrative of the innocent grandfather being systematically erased by the voices of the people Thorne had terrorized for 3 decades. As the afternoon session continued, the prosecution brought in a final, expert witness, a forensic psychologist specializing in the behavioral patterns of offenders who lead double lives. Dr. Elena Rossi, a brilliant and sharp-tongued analyst, provided the final, intellectual framework for the jury to understand the defendant. She explained that individuals like Thorne don't commit crimes of passion, they commit crimes of entitlement. The defendant built a life of virtue as a form of intellectual game, she testified, her tone cool and professional. He took immense satisfaction in the fact that he was hiding in plain sight. It wasn't about the murder anymore. It was about the secret. The secret was his way of exercising a godlike power over the people around him. The murder was the foundation. The respectability was the architecture. Thorne's response to this analysis was to slowly close his eyes, as if by shutting out the world, he could shut out the forensic truth of his own mind. He was no longer trying to defend himself. He was trying to disappear. But the room was filled with the evidence of his existence, the echoes of his past, and the unwavering, collective focus of the people who had finally brought him to account. As the judge prepared to adjourn for the day, she addressed the jury with a solemnity that indicated the trial was nearing its climax. You have heard the facts, you have heard the testimony, and you have heard the impact. Tomorrow we will move to the final arguments, and then the case will be in your hands. I ask that you hold your deliberations with the gravity this moment demands. The news of the day's testimony spread through Boston with the speed of a shockwave. The evening news cycles were dominated by clips of David Jenkins's testimony, his words being repeated, dissected, and analyzed by legal commentators across the nation. For the people of Boston, the trial of Elias Thorne had become a mirror, a reflection of their own assumptions about who they thought was safe and who was capable of horror. The city was braced for the final verdict, but the Real resolution had already occurred in that courtroom. The truth had been spoken. The voices of the victims had finally drowned out the silence of the killer, and the carefully crafted mask of the beloved grandfather had been torn away, leaving behind the stark, undeniable reality of a predator who had finally been caught in the snare of his own past. As the night fell over the city, the atmosphere was one of tense, expectant silence. Thorne was back in his cell, isolated, alone, and, for the first time in his life, utterly transparent. The detectives, the prosecutors, and the legal team were all engaged in the final, exhausting work of closing the book on the most significant case in the city's modern history. They were not just finishing a legal process. They were finalizing a historical account of a tragedy that had waited 32 years for its resolution. The evidence was secured, the witnesses were heard, and the truth had been forged into an undeniable, permanent record. The trial was approaching its conclusion, but the echo of the day, the quiet, firm voice of David Jenkins, and the unyielding precision of the forensic evidence would remain long after the final verdict was read. The man who had once been a pillar of the community was now nothing more than a witness to his own destruction, a personification of the idea that no matter how deep the secret is buried, the truth will always have its day in court. The final chapter was waiting to be written, and the outcome had never been more certain. The law, the evidence, and the voices of the victims had aligned, and the path to justice, while agonizingly long, had finally reached its end. The penultimate day of the trial dawned with a spectral light that seemed to bleach the color from the Boston streets, casting a pall of anticipation over the courthouse plaza. Inside the chamber, the air was not merely tense. It was vibrating with the terminal energy of a long-delayed truth approaching its final horizon. The defense had rested, their arguments shredded by the sheer weight of the forensic timeline and the unshakable testimony of the victim's family. Elias Thorne, the man who had occupied the role of the city's favorite grandfather, sat in the defendant's chair, a shriveled husk of his former persona. He no longer looked like the man who managed budgets and school policies. He looked like a man who had already internalized his own obsolescence. The trial had moved past the stage of dispute and into the stage of ritual, a systematic, cold-blooded dismantling of a life that had been built on a foundation of hollow sand. District Attorney Marcus Thorne rose for the prosecution's closing argument, his movements deliberate, his presence commanding. He did not need to shout. He did not need to resort to the inflammatory theatrics of a lesser attorney. He simply opened a physical folder and placed a photograph of Sarah Jenkins on the podium, followed by a photo of the man sitting behind him. For 32 years, he began, his voice low and resonant. This man lived in the light. He went to work. He bought his groceries. He played with his grandchildren. He sat in the pews of a church and bowed his head in prayer, all while holding the secret of his own darkness in the palms of his hands. He didn't just escape notice. He engineered his own invisibility. He understood that society is programmed to trust the face of a grandfather, and he used that trust as a weapon against the very people he claimed to serve. He then proceeded to weave the disparate strands of the evidence into a single, cohesive narrative of calculated malice. He walked the jury through the mechanical sabotage of the car, the chilling, precise movements of the abduction, and the cold, unfeeling disposal of a life that Thorne had deemed expendable for his own amusement. This was not a crime of passion, Marcus Thorne insisted. There is no passion in a life lived by a script. This was a crime of arrogance, the absolute, unwavering belief that he was smarter than the victim, smarter than the police, and smarter than the city of Boston itself. He treated Sarah Jenkins as a variable to be removed from his path, and when the investigation began to stir, he simply slipped into the crowd, knowing that the most effective way to commit a crime in this city is to be exactly the kind of man nobody would ever think to question. The jury listened in a state of rapt, agonizing attention. The defense attorney, Richard Sterling, looked as though he were aging 10 years by the minute. His closing argument, when it finally came, was a desperate, grasping attempt to appeal to the jury's humanity, to the idea that Thorne was a different man than he had been in 1994. "You are not here to judge the man who stood in the marsh on that night," Sterling argued, his voice cracking with a forced, performative emotion. "You are here to judge the man who sits before you today. Look at him. Look at the life he has built. Does justice demand the destruction of an old man for the sins of his youth? Is there no room for the redemption of a life that has been marked by decades of service and care?" But the argument fell flat, hitting the silence of the courtroom like a lead weight. The jury saw the redemption for what it was, a managed performance. The prosecution's rebuttal was brief, sharp, and devastatingly effective. "Redemption is not a life lived in fear of being discovered," the district attorney retorted, his voice rising in righteous, controlled indignation. "Redemption is not a secret kept for 32 years. Redemption is the truth. And Elias Thorne has spent his entire adult life running from that truth as fast as he could. Do not let the gray hair and the quiet demeanor fool you. Justice is not a calculation of his age. It is a calculation of his actions. And the action we are here to judge is the violent, premature end of a young woman's life." As the jury was ushered out to begin their deliberations, the courtroom felt as though it had been holding its breath for an eternity. The families involved in the trial retreated to the sequestered rooms, their faces masked by a mixture of exhaustion and a frantic, agonizing hope. The media presence outside was absolute, a wall of microphones and cameras waiting for the signal that would define the rest of their news cycles. For the detectives involved in the investigation, the moment was bittersweet. Sarah Miller sat in the hallway, her head in her hands, the reality of the impending verdict feeling less like a triumph and more like the end of a long, bruising marathon. She had lived with Sarah Jenkins in her head for so long that the prospect of the trial ending felt like a form of personal mourning. Inside the deliberations room, the jury faced a task that was as simple as it was profound. They were not deciding on an interpretation of complex, abstract law. They were deciding on a reality that had been laid bare by the relentless progress of science. The DNA evidence was the undisputed tether, the undeniable, biological truth that linked Elias Thorne to the marshland and to the death of Sarah Jenkins. Every juror knew that they were the final gatekeepers of a truth that had been locked away for over 3 decades. They went through the evidence file item by item. The diary entry, the tire tracks, the genetic profile, the secret journals, the collective weight of which made any notion of reasonable doubt seem like a fantasy. Outside, the hours stretched into a surreal, suspended existence. Night fell over Boston, the city lights shimmering in the reflection of the harbor, the cold winter air biting at the skin of the reporters who remained stationed on the plaza. Thorne was kept in the holding area, the silence around him absolute. The guards reported that he had stopped talking entirely. He sat with his eyes closed, his breathing rhythmic and shallow, his mind seemingly retreated to the only place it had truly occupied for the better part of a lifetime, the memory of a cold, snowy night and the intoxicating, hollow power of the secret he had kept. He was a man who had been caught by the future, and now he was simply waiting for the verdict to confirm his total, absolute erasure. The deliberation lasted well into the night, the only sounds being the occasional hushed tones of the jurors as they verified the forensic markers one last time. There was no argument, no discord. There was only a shared, solemn recognition of the duty they were performing. They were not just convicting a man. They were closing a wound that had been open since the end of the Cold War. As the jurors finalized their decision, they felt the weight of history, A history that had seen a young woman's dreams extinguished and a predator walk among them, protected by the very virtues he was mimicking. They were the ones who would finally, definitively, flip the switch from darkness to light. When the signal was finally sent to the bailiffs that a verdict had been reached, the sudden, frantic activity in the building was like a physical shock. The families were notified, the legal teams were pulled from their offices, and the judge took her seat at the bench with a look of stern, focused purpose. Thorne was led back in, the chains on his wrists rattling in the silence of the room. He looked older, his skin sallow under the harsh, artificial light, his eyes darting toward the gallery, but finding no comfort. He was a man who had built his life on the performance of his innocence, and he was now standing on the threshold of the final, unavoidable truth. The room grew silent, the kind of silence that precedes a tectonic shift, as the jury foreman stood up, his voice steady, his eyes locked on the judge, prepared to deliver the conclusion of a life's work. The trial was ending, but the story of the truth and the memory of Sarah Jenkins were just beginning to be fully integrated into the public record of the city. The verdict was the culmination, but the journey was the true testament to the persistence of the human drive to know. Justice, it seemed, was not a destination. It was the inevitable, relentless arrival of the truth. The gavel strike did not merely announce a verdict. It shattered the reality that Elias Thorne had inhabited for 32 years. As the foreman spoke the word guilty, the sound seemed to resonate through the very foundation of the courthouse, an undeniable, permanent anchor in the stream of time. Elias Thorne did not react with a flourish or a cry. He simply sat down, his hands finally coming to rest on the table, as if they were heavy weights he could no longer hold. The gallery erupted in a chaotic, visceral release of emotion, sobs, gasps, and the collective, ragged breathing of people who had been waiting for this moment since the mid-90s. The beloved grandfather was gone. In his place sat a convicted murderer, his legacy officially reduced to the clinical, unvarnished truth of his actions. In the hallways of the Boston Police Department, the news was met with a grim, professional satisfaction. For the cold case unit, the trial was not just a victory. It was a validation of every hour spent poring over yellowed pages and resequencing degraded strands of DNA. Detective Sarah Miller stood by the evidence locker, her hand resting on the box labeled Jenkins, Sarah, a box that had been the center of her universe for the better part of 3 years. The weight of the file seemed to lift, the physical burden of the mystery finally replaced by the clear, sharp edge of finality. She knew that the work wasn't finished. The sentencing phase remained, and the logistical nightmare of the post-conviction appeals would soon begin, but the existential anxiety that had driven the investigation was gone. The city of Boston, meanwhile, was in a state of profound, disbelieving shock. While the forensic evidence had been clear throughout the trial, the public had held onto a shred of the myth, a lingering, irrational hope that the man they saw at the park every morning couldn't really be the man the prosecution had described. But the verdict was the hard, cold reality that refused to be dismissed. Throughout the city, neighbors gathered on porches and in local diners, talking in hushed tones about the man they thought they knew. They spoke of the dinners they had shared, the school events he had presided over, and the subtle, strange moments that had gone unnoticed, the times he had turned away from a conversation, the brief flashes of irritability, the way he had always, consistently, kept his personal life behind a thick, impenetrable veil. The media coverage shifted overnight from courtroom reporting to a broader, sociological inquiry into the Thorne phenomenon. News outlets ran segments on the psychology of the double life, featuring interviews with experts who tried to explain how a man could commit such a crime and then integrate so seamlessly into a society that prided itself on its vigilance. It was a dark, necessary mirror held up to the city, an examination of how the performance of virtue can act as a potent camouflage for the most extreme forms of depravity. The case of Elias Thorne had become a permanent part of the city's lore, a story that would be whispered to children as they grew up, a warning about the fallibility of appearances and the vital importance of looking past the mask. In the holding facility, Thorne's reality was transitioning into a state of total clinical isolation. He was no longer a person of interest. He was a convicted inmate, subject to the rigid protocols of the prison system. The guards reported that he had become completely non-communicative, spending his days in his cell staring at the wall, refusing to engage with the prison staff, the other inmates, or the legal counsel who were still attempting to manage the post-trial logistics. He was a man who had built his life on the construction of a self-narrative, and now that his narrative had been shredded, there was nothing left. He had spent 40 years erasing Sarah Jenkins from the world, and in the process, he had successfully erased his own identity, leaving behind only the shell of a man waiting for the state to finalize his obsolescence. The Jenkins family, however, began the slow, agonizing process of reclaiming their lives. The victory in court didn't erase the tragedy. It couldn't replace 32 years of birthdays, holidays, and milestones, but it allowed them to shift the focus from the search for the killer to the preservation of Sarah's memory. David Jenkins began the process of closing his sister's legal estate, a symbolic gesture that allowed the family to finally let go of the cold case status that had defined them for so long. They spoke to the press one final time, requesting the privacy that had been denied to them for 3 decades, their voices marked by the weary, profound peace of a journey finally concluded. They were no longer the family of the victim. They were simply a family who had survived the worst, and who were now tasked with the difficult, beautiful work of moving forward. As the legal teams prepared for the sentencing hearing, a process that would be the final, official, and administrative conclusion of the trial, the atmosphere in Boston continued to cool. The fever of the trial had broken, leaving behind a city that felt, in many ways, like a house after a long, devastating storm. The windows were cracked, the furniture was overturned, but the structure itself was still standing. The people of Boston returned to their routines, the morning commutes, the school runs, the office meetings, but there was a new, subtle awareness in their interactions. They were looking at each other differently. They were more observant, more measured, and perhaps more aware of the fact that the most familiar faces often hold the most guarded secrets. The prosecution's team, led by Marcus Thorne, began the grueling task of finalizing the record. They were not merely documenting the verdict. They were ensuring that the case of Elias Thorne would be preserved in a way that would withstand the scrutiny of future generations. They organized the forensic findings, the witness testimonies, and the structural analyses into a comprehensive, searchable database that would serve as a training manual for years to come. The work was dry, technical, and immensely important. It was the final, structural safeguard against the possibility of the case ever slipping back into the darkness. They were building a record that would ensure that Elias Thorne's name would remain synonymous with the truth, and that his attempt to erase Sarah Jenkins would be permanently and historically reversed. Detective Miller spent her final days on the case visiting the sites of the original 1994 investigation. She walked the marshland where the evidence had been recovered, the landscape now overgrown, the paths shifted by time and weather. It was a place of ghosts, but they didn't feel threatening anymore. They felt settled. She thought about the early days of the investigation, the frustration of the dead ends, the agonizing uncertainty of the early years, and the breakthrough of the genetic genealogy that had eventually unlocked the truth. She realized that the case had not just been a professional obligation, it had been a crucible. She had entered the investigation as a detective, and she was leaving it as a person who understood, with a profound, terrifying clarity, the limits of what we know and the infinite depth of what we are capable of hiding. The night after the verdict was finalized, Miller stood on the harbor side, watching the lights of Boston shimmer in the water. The city was alive, vibrant, and, in its own way, innocent of the shadows that had been lurking within it. The case was solved. The truth was out. But as she watched the tide move in, she understood that the truth is never truly static. It is a thing that requires maintenance. It requires the constant, active commitment of the society it serves to keep the light focused, to keep the records accurate, and to keep the memory of the lost from fading back into the silence. Elias Thorne had tried to break that connection, but the strength of the collective had proven to be the stronger force. The long, jagged, and agonizing story of Sarah Jenkins and the man who thought he could hide in plain sight had reached its final, definitive resolution, leaving behind a city that was older, sadder, and perhaps more enlightened than the one that had begun the search 32 years ago. The verdict was the end of the line, but the story remained a permanent, immovable anchor in the history of the city, a testament to the fact that no matter how carefully you build your house of lies, the truth will eventually find its way in, and when it does, it will leave nothing standing. The sentencing phase of the trial arrived with the sterile, inevitable precision of a clock ticking toward midnight. As Elias Thorne was led into the courtroom for the final time, the transformation was complete, not just in his physical frailty, which had become more pronounced under the unrelenting pressure of incarceration, but in the total evaporation of his identity. He was no longer the beloved grandfather whose name commanded respect in the school board offices. He was a cipher, a convicted murderer stripped of the social armor that had protected him for over 3 decades. The gallery was filled with the same faces that had been present since the start: the journalists, the legal analysts, and the Jenkins family, whose presence had become the courtroom's moral North Star. Judge Catherine Vance sat at the bench, her gaze fixed on the defendant with a solemnity that acknowledged the gravity of the legal record that was about to be closed. The prosecution opened with a final, devastating impact statement, not from a family member, but from the state itself. District Attorney Marcus Thorne stood before the court, his voice echoing in the chamber as he recounted the trajectory of the investigation. He emphasized that this was not merely a case of individual malice, but a case that had challenged the integrity of the community's safety net. We have been forced to look at the man who stood in our midst, who shook our hands, and who guided our children, and we have been forced to acknowledge the terrifying reality that his entire life was a performance, he declared. The sentencing today is not just about the loss of Sarah Jenkins. It is about the restoration of truth to a community that was systematically deceived by a master manipulator. Elias Thorne was then invited to address the court. It was a moment the entire city had been waiting for, the possibility of a final confession, a moment of true, unvarnished remorse. He rose, his legs trembling, and approached the microphone. The courtroom fell into a silence, so profound that the hum of the lighting seemed to roar. For a long moment, he simply stared at the floor, his face a landscape of deep, etched lines that seemed to reveal the true toll of the secrets he had carried. When he finally spoke, his voice was a thin, raspy whisper, barely audible even through the microphones. "I lived 2 lives," he began, his tone devoid of the arrogance that had defined his earlier testimony. "One was a lie, and the other was a crime. I spent 32 years trying to convince myself that the man I became could make up for the boy I was on that night. But you cannot build a life on an empty foundation. Every day I woke up, I felt the weight of Sarah's ghost, and every day I pushed it further down, hoping that if I was good enough, if I was kind enough, the truth would never find me." He paused, his eyes flickering toward the Jenkins family. "I know there is no apology that can replace the 32 years I stole from you. I know that my life, even now, is a hollow thing compared to what she would have been. I didn't want to be caught. I didn't want to lose the life I had built. That was my only motive, my own survival. And in the end, it was my own survival that destroyed me." He stopped, the confession hanging in the air, pathetic and small in the shadow of the monumental horror of his actions. He sat back down, his shoulders slumping, and for the first time, he looked not like a master of deception, but like a man who was finally, definitively alone. The judge, her expression unreadable, reviewed the state's sentencing guidelines. She spoke of the cruelty of the crime, the premeditation of the abduction, and the systemic, decades-long effort to obstruct the course of justice. "The court recognizes the defendant's age and his lack of a prior criminal record," she stated, her voice projecting a cold, uncompromising authority, "but these factors are entirely eclipsed by the nature of the offense and the calculated, persistent deceit that followed. This was a crime of absolute selfishness, followed by a lifetime of absolute cowardice. Therefore, the court sentences the defendant to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, to be served in the maximum security facility of the Commonwealth. The gavel strike that followed was the final structural collapse of Elias Thorne's reality. There were no outbursts in the gallery, only the slow, rhythmic sound of the Jenkins family standing, their expressions not of triumph, but of profound, heavy release. As the bailiffs approached Thorne to lead him away, he didn't fight. He didn't look back. He allowed himself to be shackled, his movements robotic, his existence now completely defined by the state's mandate. He was a man who had successfully performed the role of the beloved grandfather until it had become his skin, but the truth had proven to be the only thing that could not be cast aside. The trial was over, the narrative was closed, and the man who had hidden for 32 years was now moving into the permanent, unblinking glare of the consequences he had spent half a lifetime avoiding. Outside the courthouse, the city of Boston was transitioning into a different kind of reality. The case had served as a collective trauma, a crucible that had forced the population to confront the limits of their own perception. The news vans began to pack their equipment, the satellite trucks departing the plaza in a slow, mechanical procession, and the city returned to its usual, frantic pace. But the feeling in the streets was undeniably altered. The Thorne phenomenon had left a residue of caution, a quiet, pervasive awareness that the people we interact with in the light of day are not always the people they reveal themselves to be when the doors are closed. The trial was a masterclass in the necessity of vigilance, and the city would be processing its implications for decades to come. Detective Miller stood on the steps of the courthouse, watching the last of the police cruisers pull away. She felt a profound, aching sense of displacement. For 3 years, her identity had been entirely tethered to the Jenkins case, to the forensic files, the timelines, and the pursuit of Elias Thorne. She had lived in the minutiae of the man's existence, learning the rhythm of his secrets until he felt less like a suspect and more like a permanent, intrusive presence in her own life. With the verdict finalized, she felt the sudden, jarring silence of a life that no longer had a mission. She knew that the system would move on, that other cases would require her attention, and that the file of Jenkins, Sarah, would soon become a historical document, but the impact of the investigation would always remain. The legal and administrative work of the case continued in the background, a mountain of documentation that had to be filed, audited, and archived. The office of the district attorney became a site of quiet, orderly transition, the staff organizing the evidence, the transcripts, and the forensic records into a comprehensive, searchable archive. This was the true, final act of the law, the construction of a permanent, undeniable history. By ensuring that every detail was preserved, they were safeguarding the truth against the possibility of future denial, creating a record that would stand as a testament to the fact that, regardless of the time elapsed, the truth can always be retrieved from the dark. As the sun began to dip below the Boston horizon, the city lights flickered to life, one by one, creating a shimmering, urban constellation. For the families, the lawyers, the detectives, and the public, the day's events had created a strange, unfamiliar quiet. The drama had concluded, but the reality of the aftermath was just beginning to settle in. They were not just recovering from a trial, they were recovering from the truth. The story of Elias Thorne had revealed the fragility of the social contract and the terrible, hidden weight of the secrets we keep, and as the city moved into the darkness of the evening, it carried the new, sober knowledge that the truth is the only foundation upon which a community can truly, safely stand. The long, jagged road of the Thorne case had reached its final, definitive end, but the story of Sarah Jenkins, the life she had and the truth she deserved, would continue to echo, a permanent part of the history of the city, a light that had finally and permanently broken through the dark. The silence that descended upon the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in the wake of Elias Thorne's sentencing was not merely the absence of sound. It was a profound, atmospheric shift in the city's identity. The trial had been a seismic event, a tearing away of the veil that had covered the dark, subterranean reality of the Thorne case for 32 years. Now, with the finality of a life sentence and the permanent inscription of the verdict into the annals of the state, the city of Boston was forced to navigate the long, arduous process of collective healing. The The story of Elias Thorne had become a cautionary legend, a narrative woven into the fabric of the legal and social history of the region, serving as a permanent reminder of the fragility of trust and the terrifying precision with which a predator can operate within the most ordinary of lives. Within the walls of the maximum security facility where Thorne was transported, the reality of his existence had transformed into a singular, monotonous struggle for survival. Stripped of the trappings of his former life, the suburban quiet, the community involvement, the respect of his peers, he was nothing more than a number, a physical manifestation of a case file that was officially closed. The guards reported that he had become completely insular, refusing to engage with the prison population or the staff, spending his days in a state of clinical, detached observation of his own confinement. He was a man who had lived his life as a master of performance, and now, with no audience left to observe him, the performance had ceased, leaving behind only the hollow, weary shell of a person who had spent his final years waiting for the inevitable consequences of his own history. The Jenkins family, meanwhile, had begun the difficult task of integrating the resolution of the case into their personal lives. The closure that had been the focus of the trial was, in reality, a lifelong process, a reconciliation of the loss they had suffered with the truth that had finally been revealed. They had moved away from the public eye, their presence in the media having served its purpose, and were now focused on the quiet, private work of remembrance. For them, Sarah was no longer the centerpiece of a cold case, a symbol of a lost generation, or the reason for a sensationalized legal battle. She was, once again, their sister, their daughter, and their friend, a person whose life, while tragically cut short, was reclaimed from the shadow of the man who had tried to erase her. Detective Sarah Miller, however, found herself at a crossroads. The case had defined her professional existence for 3 years, and with its conclusion, she was forced to reckon with the void left behind. She spent her days returning the artifacts of the investigation to their proper places, the files, the digital records, and the remaining physical evidence. She walked the halls of the department with a sense of profound, lingering reflection, aware that her work had permanently altered the trajectory of the Boston Police Department. The protocol she had helped establish, the shift toward a more aggressive, forensic-led approach to cold cases, had already begun to pay dividends in other, unrelated investigations. The Thorne effect was the new standard, a systematic refusal to let any crime, no matter how old or how obscured by time, remain unanswered. The societal implications of the trial continued to ripple through the city. Neighborhood associations held meetings to discuss the importance of community vigilance, though the term was stripped of its former, naive connotations. People began to view their surroundings with a more discerning, cautious eye, not out of a sense of paranoia, but out of a realization that safety is a collaborative project, one that requires a willingness to look past the surface-level performance of those we encounter. The case of Elias Thorne had taught the city of Boston that goodness is not a static trait that one can rely on. It is an action, a daily commitment, and something that can be counterfeited by those with enough patience and enough malice. It was a sobering, necessary lesson in the complexities of human character. In the legal and academic spheres, the case was being prepared for inclusion in national forensic textbooks. Scholars from across the country converged on the archives of the Massachusetts court system, seeking to understand the specific chain of evidence and the successful, meticulous application of investigative genetic genealogy that had led to the arrest. They analyzed the diary entry, the tire tracks, and the DNA match as a singular, masterclass-level study in how to bridge the gap between 1994 and the modern era. The trial of Elias Thorne had provided a map for others to follow, ensuring that the techniques used to solve the case were not just a lucky break, but a scalable, replicable, and definitive path to justice for victims whose cases had long since gone dark. As the months of autumn turned into a biting, unforgiving winter, the city of Boston began to experience a change in the atmosphere. The trial was no longer the subject of every local conversation. It was becoming a part of the city's history, a chapter that had been written, edited, and closed. The news vans had packed their equipment, the reporters had moved on to the next set of breaking headlines, and the courthouse plaza, once a site of frantic, high-pressure activity, returned to its usual, bustling pace. The world, in its indifferent, relentless march, was continuing to spin, leaving the Thorne trial as an anchor in the past, a marker of where the city had been and a standard for where it was going. Detective Miller, during a final visit to the marshland, stood at the edge of the water, the same place where the remnants of Sarah Jenkins's life had been preserved for decades. She looked out over the freezing, still water, the landscape the same as it had been on that November night in 1994, yet fundamentally changed by the resolution of the mystery. She thought of the man in his prison cell, the family in their quiet home, and the girl whose life had been the catalyst for it all. The work had been grueling, the cost had been high, and the journey had been long, but she realized that justice, while often arriving far too late, was a vital, non-negotiable component of a functioning society. It was the only thing that stood between the chaos of the crime and the order of the law. The record of the case was officially sealed, the physical files moved to long-term storage, and the administrative life of the Boston Police Department returned to its routine of processing the new, the current, and the immediate. But for those who had been involved, the detectives, the prosecutors, the witnesses, and the observers, the case would always remain a touchstone of their professional and personal lives. They were part of a history that had finally been aligned, a story that had finally reached its conclusion, and a truth that had finally, through a combination of forensic miracle and human tenacity, been brought to the light. The Thorne case was over, but the memory of it, the cold, the mask, the secret, and the truth, would persist as a permanent feature of the city's landscape. In the final, contemplative days of the year, the city held a small, informal memorial in honor of Sarah Jenkins, not as a victim, but as a person. The service was small, attended only by those who had been closest to her, and it focused on the future that had been lost and the dignity that had been restored. It was a service of peace, an attempt to replace the sensation of the trial with the sensation of a life remembered. The city was finally and definitively able to stop asking who and how, and was finally, for the first time in 32 years, allowed to simply say her name. The Thorne chapter was closed, the book was put away, and Boston moved on, not by forgetting, but by acknowledging the gravity of the past and continuing into the uncertainty of the future, aware, at last, of the truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. The final echoes of the Boston case did not dissipate with the legal closing of the file or the quiet incarceration of Elias Thorne. They settled into the collective consciousness of the city, transforming into a permanent, sobering touchstone for how justice is understood in the modern era. As the years turned into a decade, the story of Sarah Jenkins transitioned from a sensational, headline-grabbing trial into a profound case study in the resilience of the truth. It became a parable about the fragility of human memory and the indomitable power of scientific inquiry. The case had effectively dismantled the cynical belief that time acts as a natural statute of limitations for the most heinous crimes, proving instead that the digital and forensic age had granted society the tools to reclaim the past, one microscopic thread of genetic data at a time. Detective Sarah Miller, now retired from the front lines of active investigation, found herself frequently returning to the Boston Police Department, not as a detective, but as a consultant for the city's cold case task force. She would walk the halls of the building, her footsteps echoing against the linoleum, thinking of the quiet, dusty box that had lived in the evidence locker for so many decades. She realized that her work had never been about the closure of a single file. It had been about the restoration of order to a chaotic, lingering tragedy. The Thorne investigation had been a violent, necessary disruption to the status quo, forcing the city to confront the reality that secrets are not permanent, but merely waiting for the right technology to illuminate them. In the years following the case, the Sarah Jenkins Foundation flourished under the guidance of David Jenkins. It grew from a local support group into a national organization, partnering with laboratories and private research firms to sponsor the testing of decades-old DNA samples that had been ignored by underfunded agencies. The foundation's success was measured in the names of victims finally identified, in the notification of families who had lived for generations without answers, and in the quiet, dignified resolutions that followed the cold, hard science of the new forensic age. David himself became a beacon of quiet resilience, his journey from the grieving brother in the courtroom to a man leading a national movement serving as a powerful, cinematic testament to the idea that grief, when channeled into action, can fundamentally reshape the landscape of justice. The prison system, too, experienced a fundamental shift in how it handled the long-term incarceration of cold case offenders. The institutional knowledge gained from Thorne's late-life admission and his subsequent psychological collapse became part of the training for correctional officers and prison psychologists. They were taught to recognize the specific patterns of long-term compartmentalization, the way that predators like Thorne could maintain a facade of normalcy for decades, and the catastrophic psychological impact that occurs when that facade is finally breached by the truth. The facility that had been the final, desolate chapter of the killer's life became a hub for this research, proving that even in the darkest, most controlled environments, there is still knowledge to be gleaned about the nature of human depravity and the fragility of the lies we tell ourselves to survive. The physical landscape of the Boston suburbs continued to evolve, but the park dedicated to Sarah Jenkins remained a constant, quiet monument. It was a place where the seasons were observed with a heightened sense of meaning. In the spring, when the wildflowers bloomed in the meadow, residents would speak of the life that had been promised to her. In the autumn, when the wind whipped through the trees, they would acknowledge the darkness that had once threatened to consume their sense of safety. The park became a place where the young people of the city were introduced to their own history, learning that their security was not a guaranteed birthright, but a fragile condition that had been fought for, reclaimed, and finally protected by the persistence of those who refused to let a young woman's light be extinguished. As the decade drew to a close, the advancements in forensic genealogy accelerated at a pace that even Detective Miller had not anticipated. The techniques used to identify Elias Thorne, the public databases, the family tree construction, the precise extraction of DNA from non-traditional sources, were now considered the gold standard, implemented as a matter of routine in every district attorney's office across the nation. The Thorne effect was the term coined by legal scholars to describe this era, a period defined by the systemic resolution of thousands of unsolved homicides. It was a golden age of accountability, driven by the realization that science could bridge the gap between the moment of a crime and the eventual, inevitable arrival of the truth. Reflecting on the entire arc of the investigation, one realizes that the story of Sarah Jenkins was never just about a murder. It was about the resilience of the truth against the erosion of time. The evidence, those mundane, forgotten objects, was a reminder that we are all, in some way, leaving behind the evidence of who we are. Our actions, our decisions, and our darkest secrets are constantly being recorded in the physical world, waiting for the technology of the future to reveal their meaning. It is a terrifying yet comforting thought that in the grand, unfolding history of human events, nothing is ever truly erased, and everything that has happened is merely waiting for the light to finally, definitively, shine upon it. The case also sparked a cultural conversation about the nature of forgiveness and the limits of the law. Did the death of Elias Thorne in a prison medical ward offer real justice? Or was it merely the administrative conclusion of a mechanical process? For the Jenkins family, the answer was found in the quiet, everyday ability to exist without the weight of the unknown. They did not seek the theatrical fire of retribution. They sought the clarity of the truth. And in that clarity, they found a peace that had been denied to them for 32 years. Justice, in the end, was not about the punishment of the man. It was about the affirmation of the victim. The recognition that Sarah Jenkins's life had value, that her death had mattered, and that the society she lived in would not stop until the record of her life was set straight. As the final chapters of this chronicle are written, the image of Boston remains, a city that survived, a family that persisted, and a story that became a legend. It is a narrative that reminds us that the past is not a foreign country. It is a neighbor, a constant companion that walks beside us, shaping the reality of our present. The case of the Boston 1994 cold case solved, beloved grandfather arrested at his 80th birthday, will forever stand as a monument to the fact that while we may be haunted by the darkness of our history, we are also empowered by the light of our progress. The cycle is finished, the record is sealed, and the story of the truth is, and will always remain, complete. The long night of uncertainty has yielded to the morning, and we now walk in the light of what they fought so hard to uncover, aware, at last, of the truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. The passage of time inside a maximum security penitentiary does not flow with the natural, rhythmic grace of the outside world. It stagnates, pooling into a dense, suffocating sequence of identical days and endless, echoing nights. For Elias Thorne, the man who had once masterfully orchestrated every second of his existence to project an aura of unassailable suburban virtue, time had become his ultimate, unrelenting tormentor. Stripped of his tailored suits, his carefully curated social calendar, and the adoring gaze of a family he had systematically deceived, he was reduced to the harsh, monochromatic reality of inmate number 093847. The concrete walls of his cell offered no reflections, no audience to applaud his benevolence, and no shadows deep enough to hide the monstrous truth that had finally caught up with him. He was 82 years old now, his body failing under the crushing weight of institutional confinement, but it was the slow, agonizing decay of his mind that provided the most profound, poetic justice of all. The man who had spent 32 years trying to erase the memory of Sarah Jenkins was now, ironically and tragically, beginning to lose the grip on his own memory, his mind fracturing under the weight of dementia. As the neurological decline took hold, the carefully constructed compartments of Thorne's mind began to bleed into one another, creating a terrifying, waking nightmare. He would sit on the edge of his narrow, steel-framed cot, staring at the reinforced glass of his cell door, and forget where he was. He would call out for his daughter, demanding to know what time the neighborhood association meeting was scheduled, only to be met with the cold, indifferent silence of the cell block. But the cruelty of his condition was that while the details of his fabricated, perfect life slipped through his fingers like dry sand, the visceral, horrific memory of the freezing November night in 1994 remained crystal clear, burned into his failing synapses with a terrifying permanence. He could no longer remember the names of his grandchildren, but he could remember the exact sound of the wind howling through the Boston marshland. He could remember the terrified, desperate look in the eyes of a 22-year-old nursing student as the realization of his true nature finally dawned on her. The mask had completely dissolved, leaving only the monster trapped inside a decaying vessel, forced to relive the defining cruelty of his existence on an endless, inescapable loop. While Thorne withered in the sterile isolation of his confinement, the physical remnants of his crime were undergoing a completely different kind of transformation back in the heart of Boston. The evidence box labeled Jenkins, Sarah, November 14th, 94 was no longer kept in the active, high-security investigation vaults of the Homicide Unit. It had been transferred to the state's Forensic Historical Archive, an immaculate, climate-controlled facility designed to preserve the artifacts that had fundamentally altered the landscape of Massachusetts jurisprudence. The items inside, the degraded steering wheel cover, the fragments of the wool-blend cardigan, and the small, heartbreaking diary, were no longer merely pieces of evidence. They had been elevated to the status of historical relics. They were the physical embodiments of a paradigm shift, the tangible proof that the era of the unsolvable mystery had officially, definitively come to a close. Law enforcement academies and forensic science programs from across the country requested supervised access to these artifacts, utilizing them as the cornerstone of their advanced training modules. Young recruits, born years after Sarah Jenkins had been abducted, would stand around the secure viewing tables, staring down at the diary entry where she had noted the suspiciously polite man who had helped her. The instructors did not just teach the science of touch DNA or the methodology of investigative genetic genealogy. They taught the philosophy of the Thorne case. They used Elias Thorne as the ultimate cautionary tale, dismantling the myth of the obvious suspect. They drilled into the minds of the next generation of detectives that monsters do not always lurk in dark alleys with bared teeth. More often than not, they are standing in the bright fluorescent light of a grocery store, smiling warmly, holding the door open for the very people they intend to destroy. The artifacts served as a permanent, chilling reminder that human intuition is fallible, but the microscopic betrayals of biology are absolute. This cultural and institutional shift, the pervasive, systemic realization that safety is often an illusion manufactured by predators, began to seep deeply into the psychological fabric of the Boston suburbs. The residents of the quiet, tree-lined streets where Thorne had lived for decades found themselves permanently altered by the proximity to such calculated evil. The house where Thorne had been arrested on his 80th birthday had eventually been sold, but the new owners tore it down to the foundation, unable to live within the walls that had sheltered a killer. The empty lot remained for years, a physical scar on the neighborhood, a silent monument to the deception that had occurred there. Neighbors who had once prided themselves on their tight-knit community became more guarded, more observant. The easy, unearned trust that had defined their interactions was replaced by a pragmatic, necessary skepticism. They realized that Thorne had not been an anomaly created by the city. He was a product of their own willingness to look the other way, to accept the comfortable lie rather than interrogate the unsettling truth. For the Jenkins family, navigating this new reality was a complex, exhausting endeavor. The conviction of Elias Thorne had provided legal closure, but it had also unleashed a new wave of public scrutiny and historical stewardship. David Jenkins, Sarah's brother, had become the reluctant, stoic face of the victims' rights movement in New England. He spent his days managing the Sarah Jenkins Foundation, channeling his lifelong grief into a relentless, administrative war against the backlog of unsolved homicides in the state. He met with families whose eyes mirrored the exact, haunting despair he had carried for 32 years. He did not offer them false hope, nor did he promise them that the pain would ever fully dissipate. Instead, he offered them the blueprint of his family's survival. He told them about the agonizing wait, the false leads, the suffocating silence, and the eventual, explosive arrival of the truth. He became a living testament to the fact that while the justice system is imperfect and agonizingly slow, the sheer force of human persistence can eventually bend the arc of history toward accountability. David's work with the foundation also forced him to confront the complex, often disturbing nature of the public's fascination with true crime. The Thorne case had generated podcasts, documentary series, and countless articles, turning his sister's murder into a form of dark, consumable entertainment. He fought tirelessly to reclaim the narrative, ensuring that the focus remained not on the macabre genius of the killer, but on the profound, incalculable loss of the victim. He demanded that the media emphasize the systemic failures that had allowed Thorne to